Greetings, midnight traveler. Tonight on NightSleepWhisper, a dark yet enchanting odyssey awaits you. A train that has circled for 10 years without stopping, erased identities, and the mysterious architect beyond time. You are about to hear Sarah's entire saga, from the moment she stepped onto the 11:15 to the very last station of her freedom. Set your volume to a whisper, release your mind, and let go. Some journeys aren't about the destination. They are simply meant to be lived. If you're ready, our story begins. Sarah stood on the cold platform of the city station. The rain was very heavy. It hit the metal roof above her head with a constant, loud noise. She looked at her expensive watch. It was 11:15 p.m. She was very late. Her regular train always left at 11 p.m., but her meeting at the office lasted too long. She was a lawyer, and her job was very difficult. Now, she just wanted to go home and sleep in her warm bed. The station was almost empty. The bright lights in the ceiling were flickering. Sarah felt a bit nervous. She held her leather bag tightly against her side. She looked at the big digital clock on the wall. The screen was blank. There were no more trains to Oakhaven tonight on the official schedule. Oakhaven was a small, quiet town far away from the busy city. Sarah lived there alone in a small house near the trees. "I am so tired," Sarah said to herself. Her voice sounded small in the big, empty station. Suddenly, she heard a deep, heavy noise. It came from the tracks in the distance. A bright, white light appeared. Sarah was very surprised. She looked at her watch again. A train was coming, but it was not on the list. The light became brighter and brighter until it hurt her eyes. The train moved slowly and smoothly into the station. It was not a modern train. It was very old and made of heavy, dark metal. The windows were large and clean. Inside the carriages, the lights were soft and yellow. There were no people visible through the glass. It looked like a beautiful train from a history book. The train stopped perfectly in front of Sarah. A cloud of white steam rose from under the wheels. It moved around Sarah's legs like a cold mist. The air suddenly smelled like old paper and expensive wood. Sarah looked at the side of the carriage. In beautiful gold letters, it said, "The Midnight Express." The doors of the carriage opened with a smooth, sliding motion. There was no conductor on the platform to greet her. There was no one to ask for information. Sarah looked inside. The seats were made of soft, red velvet. The floor had a thick, beautiful carpet. It looked very comfortable and very warm. Sarah looked back at the dark, wet station. Then she looked at the bright, inviting interior of the train. She was cold and her coat was wet from the rain. She did not want to wait for a taxi in the dark. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the train. The floor felt very solid under her black shoes. As soon as she entered, the doors closed behind her. The sound of the heavy rain became very quiet. The train began to move immediately. It moved very fast, but the ride was very smooth. Sarah sat down on a red velvet seat. She did not know exactly where the train was going, but she felt a strange sense of peace. She looked out the window. The city lights began to disappear into the dark night. She was finally on her way. Sarah sat on the soft velvet seat and tried to relax. The inside of the train was very different from the cold station. It was warm and the air was very still. The walls of the carriage were made of dark, polished wood. Above her, there were small lamps that gave off a gentle, yellow light. The train was very quiet. She could only hear the low, rhythmic hum of the wheels on the metal tracks. She looked at her reflection in the window. She looked tired, but she was happy to be out of the rain. "This is a very lucky train," she whispered. "I hope it stops at Oakhaven soon." Suddenly, a heavy wooden door at the front of the carriage opened. A man walked slowly toward her. He was tall and thin. He wore a dark blue uniform with bright, gold buttons that shone in the lamplight. On his head was a tall, stiff hat. His face was very pale, and he had a long, grey mustache. He walked with a slight limp, but he did not make a sound on the thick carpet. Sarah reached for her bag. She wanted to find her wallet. "Good evening," she said politely. "I am sorry. I do not have a ticket yet." The station office was closed. The man did not look angry. He did not even look surprised. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. He handed it to Sarah without saying a word. His hands were covered in white gloves. "What is this?" Sarah asked as she took the paper. "Your ticket," the man replied. His voice was very deep and very calm. It sounded like the wind in the trees. Sarah looked at the ticket. It was not a normal train ticket. It was not made of thin plastic or cheap paper. It was made of thick, heavy card with beautiful gold edges. There was no price on it. There was no date and no seat number. In the center of the ticket, there was a word written in elegant, black ink. It did not say Oakhaven. It said the Silver Valley. Sarah frowned. She lived in this area for 10 years, but she never heard of a place called the Silver Valley. "Excuse me," Sarah said, looking up. "I think there is a mistake. I need to go to Oakhaven. Where is the Silver Valley? Is it near the coast?" The man in the uniform did not answer. He simply bowed his head a little bit. He turned around and walked back toward the heavy wooden door. "Wait," Sarah called out. She stood up to follow him. "How much do I owe you for this? And when do we arrive?" The man reached the door. He turned his head and looked at her one last time. "The train always arrives exactly when it needs to," he said. Then, he opened the door and walked into the next carriage. The door closed with a firm, solid motion. Sarah was alone again. She looked down at the strange ticket in her hand. The gold edges seemed to glow in the dim light. She felt a small shiver of fear in her chest. She looked out the window, but she could see nothing. The world outside was completely black. Sarah stood by the heavy wooden door for a long moment. Her heart was beating a little fast. She looked at the ticket in her hand again. The gold edges were very bright. She decided to move forward. She wanted to find more people. A train this big and beautiful surely had other passengers. She pushed the door open. It was heavy, but it moved easily. On the other side, she found a long hallway. The walls here were covered in a soft, green fabric. There were small brass signs on each door. She walked past several doors until she saw one with a large, silver number on it. It was the number 7. Sarah opened the door to carriage number 7 and stopped. She gasped in surprise. This room was even more beautiful than the last one. It was a private carriage with only a few large seats. The windows were covered with heavy blue curtains made of silk. In the center of the room, there was a small table made of dark, shining wood. On the table, there was a glass of water and a small plate of biscuits. "Hello," Sarah called out. "Is anyone here?" There was no answer. The only sound was the soft, low vibration of the train moving through the night. Sarah walked into the room. The carpet was so thick that her footsteps made no sound at all. She felt like she was walking on a cloud. She sat down in a large chair near the window. It was the most comfortable chair she ever felt. She looked around the carriage. There were many interesting things to see. On the walls, there were small paintings of old cities and mountains. There was a bookshelf in the corner with many old books. The books had no titles on their covers. They were all bound in black leather. Sarah felt very strange. She was a lawyer, and she liked things to be clear and logical. But nothing about this train was logical. Why was it so empty? Why was the ticket so strange? She looked at the glass of water on the table. Small bubbles moved slowly to the top of the glass. She was very thirsty, but she was afraid to drink it. She pulled the blue curtain back a little bit to look outside. She hoped to see a station or a road. But the glass was like a dark mirror. She could only see her own tired face and the reflection of the golden lamps. The train was moving very fast now. She could feel the power of the engine through the floor. Sarah leaned her head back against the soft chair. She felt very heavy. The warmth of the carriage was making her sleepy. She closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about her office and her busy life in the city. Those things felt very far away now. In carriage number 7, time felt different. It felt slow and heavy, like the deep water of a lake. She was the only person in this beautiful, silent world. Sarah woke up with a start. The train was still moving smoothly through the night. She did not know how long she slept. The soft yellow light in carriage number 7 was still dim and warm. She felt a bit cold now, so she pulled her coat closer to her body. She looked down at the floor near her feet. Something was reflecting the light from the ceiling. It was a bright, golden spark on the thick carpet. She leaned forward and reached for the object. Her fingers touched something cold and heavy. She picked it up and held it in the light. It was an expensive pocket watch made of solid gold. A long, thin chain was attached to the top. The watch felt very smooth in her hand, like a stone from a river. There were no names or letters on the outside. It was simple, heavy, and very beautiful. Sarah felt the weight of the metal. Who dropped this? She wondered. She thought about the man in the grey suit from the earlier carriage. Maybe it belonged to him. She looked at the door of the carriage, but it remained closed. No one was there. The carriage was still perfectly silent. She found a small, round button on the top of the watch. She pressed it gently with her thumb. The golden cover opened. Inside, the watch was very elegant. The background was white like milk, and the numbers were painted in thin, black ink. But something was very strange. The long, black hands of the watch were not moving. Sarah held the watch close to her ear. She wanted to hear the steady, rhythmic sound of the machine inside. She listened very carefully. However, there was no sound at all. The watch was completely silent. She looked at the time on the face again. Both hands pointed to the same spot. It was exactly 11:15. Sarah felt a cold chill on her neck. 11:15 was the exact time she looked at her own watch on the station platform before the train arrived. She looked at her left wrist now. Her own watch was missing. She searched her bag and her coat pockets, but she could not find it. Her wrist felt light and empty. "Is this my watch?" She whispered to herself. But her own watch was silver, modern, and cheap. This watch was gold and looked very old. She tried to turn the small wheel at the top to move the hands. The wheel did not move. It was stuck. She looked out the window again. The train was moving through a very dark forest now. The tall trees looked like giant, thin shadows against the dark sky. Sarah felt like the watch was a warning. The time 11:15 was frozen. On this train, it seemed that time did not want to move forward. She put the gold watch into her pocket. She decided she needed to find the conductor again. She stood up and walked toward the door. Sarah reached for the handle of the door, but suddenly the floor shook. The train was losing speed. The soft hum of the wheels changed into a heavy, grinding sound as the metal pressed against the tracks. Sarah grabbed the edge of a seat to stay standing. The train gave a final, slow shiver and stopped completely. She looked out the window. They were at a station, but it did not look like Oakhaven. There were no bright signs and no people waiting with umbrellas. The platform was made of old, grey wood. A single lamp hung from a tall pole. moving slowly in the wind. The light was weak and orange. It did not show much of the world outside. The door at the end of the carriage opened. A man stepped inside. He was very tall and wore a perfectly clean grey suit. His tie was dark, and his shoes were polished until they shone like mirrors. He did not have any luggage. He did not look wet from the rain. He looked like he was going to a very important business meeting. The man walked down the aisle. His face was hard to see in the shadows, but his eyes were sharp and bright. He stopped right in front of Sarah. Without asking for permission, he sat down in the seat directly across from her. He moved with great grace, like a cat. Sarah felt very uncomfortable. The carriage was large, and there were many empty seats. Why did he choose to sit so close to her? She held her bag tightly on her lap. "Good evening," Sarah said. Her voice felt dry in her throat. The man did not look at her at first. He pulled a small, silver case from his pocket and opened it. He took out a long, white cigarette but did not light it. He just held it between his thin fingers. "Is this train going to Oakhaven?" Sarah asked again, louder this time. The man finally turned his head. His eyes were the color of cold tea. "The name of the destination is not important," he said. His voice was smooth and very slow. "What is important is the journey." "I have a ticket for the Silver Valley," Sarah said. She showed him the gold-edged card. "But I do not know where that is. I need to go home." The man looked at the ticket and then looked at Sarah's pocket. The golden chain of the pocket watch was hanging out just a little bit. A small, strange smile appeared on his face. It was not a friendly smile. "You have the watch," he whispered. "That means the game has already started. You should be careful, Sarah." Sarah froze. "How do you know my name?" "I did not tell you my name." The man did not answer. The train began to move again. It did not start slowly this time. It jumped forward with a sudden burst of power. The dark station disappeared behind them in a second. Sarah looked at the man, but he was now looking out the window. He was silent and still, like a statue made of stone. Sarah felt the weight of the man's eyes on her. She needed to know where she was. She reached into her bag and pulled out her smartphone. The screen was very bright in the dim carriage. She looked at the top corner of the screen to check the signal. There were no bars at all. The phone said searching for a few seconds, and then it said no service. She tried to open her GPS map app. Usually, the map showed her exactly where she was on the road to Oakhaven. She liked to watch the small blue dot move along the highway. But today, the screen was empty. The map was just a large, grey square. There were no roads, no towns, and no names of rivers. The small blue circle was in the middle of the grey space, but it was not moving. It stayed perfectly still. "The technology of your city does not work here," the man in the grey suit said. He did not look at her when he spoke. He was still looking at the long, white cigarette in his fingers. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. Her voice was a little loud because she was nervous. "My phone always works. The GPS uses satellites in the sky. It does not need the train signal to know my location." The man finally turned his head. His tea-colored eyes looked very tired. "We are not under the sky, you know, Sarah. Look outside again. Look carefully this time." Sarah turned to the window. She pressed her face against the cold glass. The train was moving through a forest, but it was not a normal forest. The trees were very tall and very thin. Their branches were long and reached toward the train like thin fingers. There were no leaves on the trees, even though it was not winter. Everything was a dark, dusty gray. There were no lights anywhere in the distance. There were no houses, no street lamps, and no other cars. It was like the rest of the world disappeared. The train was the only thing that existed in this dark place. The tracks made a low, humming noise that Sarah felt in her feet and her teeth. "Where are we?" Sarah whispered. Her breath made a small cloud of mist on the window. "We are between places," the man said smoothly. "This is the forest of the forgotten. People only come here when they lose their way in their own lives." Sarah felt a ball of cold fear in her stomach. She was a lawyer. She lived in a world of facts, books, and laws. This man was talking about things that did not make sense. She tried to restart her phone. She held the power button until the screen went black. When the phone turned on again, she looked at the digital clock on the screen. It said 11:15. It was the same time as the golden pocket watch in her pocket. It was the same time as the station clock. Her heart began to beat very fast. She put the phone back in her bag. Her hands were shaking. "I want to go to another carriage," Sarah said. She stood up quickly. She did not want to be near this man anymore. The man in the grey suit did not try to stop her. He just moved his legs so she could pass him. "The front of the train is closer than the end," he said. "But the path is not easy. Be careful of what you find." Sarah did not answer him. She walked quickly toward the heavy door at the end of the room. Sarah reached the heavy wooden door at the end of carriage number 7. She grabbed the brass handle and pulled. The door did not move. She pulled harder, using all the strength in her arms. The door felt like it was part of the wall. Suddenly, the train moved sharply to the left. Sarah lost her balance and fell against the wood. A loud, metallic scraping sound came from under the floorboards. It sounded like the train was moving over broken glass. She turned around to ask the man in the grey suit for help. Her heart stopped for a second. The seat across from hers was empty. The tall man was gone. The small silver case was gone. Even the smell of his cigarette was missing from the air. The carriage was perfectly still again. There was no way he could leave through the back door without Sarah seeing him. He did not pass her to go to the front. He simply vanished into the shadows. Sarah walked back to the center of the carriage. Her footsteps were quiet on the thick carpet, but she felt like someone was watching her. She looked at the small, dark table. There was something new on the polished wood. It was a small, square piece of white paper. It was not there before. She picked up the paper. It was heavy and felt like expensive stationery. There was a single sentence written in dark, black ink. The handwriting was sharp and very neat. It said, "Do not go to the front of the train." Sarah felt a wave of confusion. Just a few minutes ago, the man told her that the front of the train was closer. Now, this note told her the opposite. Who wrote this? Was it the man in the grey suit, or was there someone else hiding in the shadows? She looked at the blue silk curtains. They moved slightly, even though the windows were closed. "This is not real," Sarah whispered. "I am dreaming. I fell asleep at the station, and I am having a bad dream." She pinched her arm hard. It hurt. The cold air in the carriage was real. The weight of the gold pocket watch in her pocket was real. She was not dreaming. She was on a train that did not exist on any map, with people who appeared and disappeared like ghosts. She looked at the two doors. One door led back to the empty carriage where she started. The other door led forward, toward the front of the train. The note warned her to stay away from the front. But the conductor went that way. The man in the grey suit mentioned the front too. Sarah did not like to follow orders when she did not understand them. She was a lawyer. She needed to find the truth. She decided to ignore the note. If the truth was at the front of the train, that is where she needed to go. She went back to the door and tried the handle again. This time, it turned easily. The door opened with a long, slow creak of old metal. A gust of ice-cold air hit her face. Sarah stepped out of carriage number 7 and into the dark hallway. Sarah stepped into the new carriage. This room was not beautiful like the others. The walls were made of cold, grey metal. There were many cabinets with heavy locks. The air smelled like oil and old metal. The lights above were very weak. They flickered every few seconds. When the lights went out for a moment, the room was completely black. Sarah felt a cold wind on her neck, even though there were no open windows. She saw a person at the end of the hallway. It was the man in the dark blue uniform. He was the conductor. He was standing near a small window, looking out at the dark forest. He held a small silver tool in his gloved hand. He was very still, like he was waiting for something to happen. "Excuse me, sir," Sarah said. Her voice shook a little. "I need help. I want to know where this train is going. I found this watch, and I saw a man in a grey suit, and now he is gone. Nothing makes sense here." The conductor did not move at first. He stayed very still, watching the shadows outside. Then, he slowly turned his body. When he looked at her, Sarah felt like the world stopped. She could not breathe. She felt her legs go weak, and she had to lean against the wall. The man's face was not the face of a stranger. He had kind, blue eyes and many small wrinkles around them. He had a small, white scar on his left chin from an old accident. It was a face Sarah knew very well. It was the face of her grandfather, Henry. But Henry died 10 years ago. Sarah was at his funeral. She remembered the cold winter day and the smell of the flowers. She remembered crying for a long time in her mother's arms. This was impossible. Her grandfather was a baker, not a train conductor. "Grandpa," she whispered. Her heart was beating very fast. The conductor looked at her for a long time. He did not smile, but his eyes were not mean. They were very sad. "You should not be here, Sarah," he said. His voice was deeper than she remembered, but the way he said her name was exactly the same. "This is not a place for the living." Sarah took a step toward him. "Is it really you? How is this possible? Am I dead? Was there an accident at the station?" The conductor shook his head slowly. He put the silver tool into his pocket. "No, you are not dead. But you are on a journey that is very dangerous. You took a train that does not stop for a long time. This train travels through memories and shadows." "I want to go back to the station," Sarah said. Tears were in her eyes. "Please, Grandpa, take me back to Oakhaven." The conductor looked at the window. The train was moving even faster now. The trees outside were just a blur of grey light. "I cannot stop the train, Sarah. I only check the tickets. The train has a mind of its own. It goes where it wants to go." He walked toward her. For a second, Sarah wanted to hug him. She wanted to feel the scratchy fabric of his coat. But as he passed under a flickering light, his face seemed to change. For a moment, he looked like a complete stranger with sharp features. Then, he looked like her grandfather once more. "Go back to your seat," he said softly. "And do not lose that watch. It is the only thing that knows the truth about time." Before Sarah could ask another question, the lights flickered and went out. The carriage was dark for 3 seconds. When the lights came back on, the conductor was gone. The metal hallway was empty. There was no sound except for the heavy metal wheels hitting the tracks. Sarah stood alone in the cold, grey hallway. Her heart was still heavy from seeing the conductor's face. "It was him," she whispered. "It was Grandpa Henry." But how could a man who died 10 years ago be on a train in the middle of a dark forest? She felt a deep sadness in her chest. She wanted to run after him, but the conductor was gone. The metal carriage was silent and empty. Suddenly, the air around her changed. Sarah felt a sharp chill on her skin. A few minutes ago, the train was warm and comfortable. Now, the The temperature was falling very fast. It felt like someone opened a giant freezer door. Sarah rubbed her arms with her hands. She pulled her coat tightly around her neck, but the cold went right through the fabric. She took a breath and saw something strange. A small, white cloud of mist came out of her mouth. Her breath was visible in the air. "Why is it so cold?" she asked. She looked at the metal walls of the carriage. Small, white crystals of ice began to grow on the grey surface. The ice spread quickly, like a winter flower opening its petals. Sarah walked toward the next door, but her feet felt heavy. The floor was now very slippery. The thick carpet from the previous carriage was gone. Here, there was only cold, hard metal. The rhythmic sound of the wheels was different now. It was a sharp, biting sound, like the train was cutting through a world of ice. She looked at her hands. Her fingers were turning a pale, blue color. She put them in her pockets to keep them warm. Her right hand touched the golden pocket watch. The metal of the watch was not cold. In fact, it felt warm against her skin. It was the only warm thing in the whole carriage. Sarah held the watch tightly. She felt a small vibration coming from it, like a tiny heart beating inside the gold case. The lights above her flickered again. They were becoming dim. The shadows on the walls grew longer and darker. Sarah saw the frost covering the light bulbs. The light became a pale, blue color. It was hard to see the end of the hallway now. The mist from her breath was so thick that she could not see her own feet. "I need to find a heater," she thought. "Or I need to find another person." She remembered the man in the grey suit. He was mysterious, but he was alive. He was a person she could talk to. Even the conductor, who looked like her grandfather, was better than being alone in this freezing dark. She reached the door at the end of the carriage. The brass handle was covered in a thick layer of white frost. Sarah was afraid to touch it with her bare skin. She used the sleeve of her coat to grab the handle. She pulled with all her strength. The door was frozen shut. She pulled again, and the ice made a loud, cracking sound as it broke. The door opened a few inches, and a blast of freezing wind hit her face. Sarah pulled the frozen handle again. The door opened only a few inches, but then it stopped. She pushed her shoulder against the wood, using all her weight. The ice made a loud, cracking noise, but the door did not move any further. She looked through the narrow gap into the next carriage. It was very dark inside, but she could see a heavy iron bar across the door on the other side. Someone had locked it from the outside. She was trapped in the freezing, grey hallway. "Hello? Is anyone there?" she shouted. Her voice sounded thin and weak. The only answer was the sound of the wind. The wind moved through the small opening in the door, making a long, low whistling sound. It felt like needles of ice hitting her skin. Sarah looked around the small space. She was between two carriages, and the metal floor was shaking violently. She was terrified. She looked at the walls, searching for a way out. She saw a small metal box near the floor. It was covered in rust and frost. There was no handle, but there was a small hole in the center. She remembered the silver key she saw the conductor using earlier. She did not have a key, but she had the golden pocket watch. She took the watch out of her pocket. The gold was still warm, which felt wonderful against her frozen fingers. She looked at the small hole in the metal box. It was the same shape as the winding wheel on top of the watch. She placed the top of the watch into the hole and turned it slowly. The metal box made a heavy, grinding sound. A small door on the box opened. Inside, there was a single red button and a small, handwritten note. The note was old and the paper was yellow. It said, "Only the lost can find the way." Sarah did not understand the note, but she knew she could not stay in the cold. She pressed the red button. Immediately, the train made a deep, metallic growl. The floor under her feet began to tilt. The train was not just moving forward anymore. It was climbing. Sarah grabbed a metal rail to stay standing. She looked out the window and gasped. The dark forest was gone. The train was now moving up a very steep track that seemed to go into the clouds. Below her, there was only a deep, black valley. The stars in the sky were not white. They were a strange, glowing purple. Suddenly, the wall next to the locked door began to shake. A secret panel in the wood slid back, revealing a small, dark space. Inside the space, there was a small mirror in a silver frame. Sarah looked into the mirror, but she did not see her own tired face. Instead, she saw a reflection of a warm library with a fireplace and a large, comfortable chair. The locked door was still shut, but this new opening offered a different path. Sarah felt a strange pull toward the mirror. The air coming from the secret panel was warm and smelled like old books. She took a deep breath and prepared to move forward into the unknown. Sarah stood in front of the secret panel. The warm air from the mirror was very nice. It was a big change from the freezing hallway. She looked at the mirror again. The library in the reflection looked so real. She could see the orange light of a fire moving on the walls. She could see the titles of books on the shelves. But when she touched the glass of the mirror, it was hard and cold. It was not a door. It was only a picture. "How do I get in there?" she asked quietly. She was shivering from the cold behind her. She knew she could not stay in the freezing hallway for much longer. Her breath was still a thick mist in the air. She took the golden pocket watch out of her pocket. It was still very warm. She held it close to her face. She looked at the frozen hands on the white dial. It was still 11:15. She noticed a very small, silver line near the edge of the glass cover. It was a tiny hinge. She never saw it before. Sarah used her fingernail to pull the edge of the glass. The glass cover opened slowly. Under the glass, the white face of the watch was not flat. There was a small, secret compartment behind the numbers. Inside the compartment, there was a tiny silver key. The key was beautiful. It was very thin and had a small heart shape at the top. Sarah took the key out with 2 fingers. It was very light. She looked at the locked door with the heavy iron bar. Then she looked at the silver mirror frame. She searched the frame for a keyhole. Near the bottom of the silver frame, hidden under a carved flower, she found it. There was a tiny hole that was the exact size of the silver key. Sarah felt a little bit of hope. She put the silver key into the hole and turned it to the right. The mirror made a long, heavy sound like a stone moving. The glass did not break. Instead, it moved backward like a real door. The smell of old books and wood smoke became much stronger. It was a wonderful smell. Sarah did not wait. She stepped through the mirror frame and into the library. As soon as both her feet were on the floor, the mirror door closed behind her. The sound of the freezing wind stopped completely. The library was very quiet and very warm. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling with thousands of books. A large, green chair sat in front of a stone fireplace. There was a fire burning in the grate, but there was no wood. The flames were a soft, steady blue color. Sarah walked to the middle of the room. She felt the warmth on her face and hands. Her blue fingers began to turn pink again. She looked around. This was the carriage from the reflection. But now she was inside it. She was safe from the cold, but she was still on the train. She was still moving toward the end of the line. She looked at the silver key in her hand. It was glowing a little bit in the blue firelight. She put it back inside the golden watch and closed the glass. She was ready to see what this library was hiding. Sarah felt much better now that she was warm. She looked at the books in the library for a few minutes. She wanted to stay in the green chair forever. But she knew she had to move. The train was still moving fast, and the mystery of her grandfather and the grey-suited man was not solved. She walked to the far end of the library. There was a large door made of heavy oak wood. It had a golden handle in the shape of a lion. She turned the handle and pushed the door open. Immediately, the smell of the room changed. It did not smell like old books anymore. Instead, it smelled like delicious food. Sarah walked into the next carriage and stopped in surprise. This was the dining carriage, and it was the most beautiful room she ever saw. The room was long and very wide. There were rows of small tables on both sides of a center aisle. Each table had a white cloth that was perfectly clean. There were crystal glasses that caught the light and silver forks and knives that shone brightly. Above each table, a small lamp with a silk shade gave a warm orange glow. But the most amazing thing was the food. On every table, there was a feast. Sarah saw large plates of roasted chicken, bowls of steaming vegetable soup, and baskets of fresh, warm bread. There were tall glasses filled with dark red juice and plates of sweet chocolate cakes. Steam rose slowly from the soup bowls, filling the air with a wonderful scent. It looked like 100 people were about to sit down for a very expensive dinner. However, the room was completely empty. Sarah walked down the center aisle, looking at the chairs. Every chair was tucked neatly under the table. No one was eating. No one was talking. There were no waiters and no chefs. The only sound was the steady, low vibration of the train, and the occasional soft sound of a silver spoon moving slightly against a plate because of the train's movement. Sarah's stomach made a loud noise. She realized she was very hungry. She did not eat dinner because of her long meeting at the office. She looked at a small table near the window. A bowl of tomato soup was waiting there. It looked perfect. She reached out her hand to touch the bowl. It was very hot. "Is anyone here?" Sarah called out. Her voice was louder than she intended. "Can I eat this?" No one answered. She looked at the kitchen door at the end of the carriage. It was closed. She felt very strange. The food was fresh and hot, as if it was placed there only a few seconds ago. But the dust on the floor told a different story. In the corners of the room, there were small piles of dust. The train was old, but the food was new. Sarah sat down at the table. She picked up a piece of bread. It was soft and warm in her hand. She was about to take a bite when she saw something strange. On the white cloth next to her plate, there was a small red stain. It was not soup. It looked like a drop of ink. She looked closer and saw that the stain was in the shape of a tiny arrow, pointing toward the floor under the table. Sarah looked at the small red arrow on the white cloth. It was very bright against the clean fabric. She felt a small chill of fear. Why was an arrow pointing to the floor? She moved the edge of the heavy tablecloth and looked under the table. The space was dark, but she saw something moving. She saw a pair of brown leather boots. Behind the boots, a woman was sitting on the floor. She was pressed against the metal wall of the train. Her face was very pale, and her eyes were wide with fear. She held a small, black notebook tightly against her chest. She looked like she was trying to become invisible. "Please, do not hurt me," the woman whispered. Her voice was thin and shaking. "I'm not going to hurt you," Sarah said quickly. She sat on the floor so she could see the woman better. She spoke softly to make her feel safe. "My name is Sarah. I am just a passenger. I am lost, too. Who are you?" The woman looked at Sarah's modern coat and then at her face. She seemed to relax a little bit. She crawled out from under the table slowly. She was an older woman, perhaps 60 years old. She wore a practical brown jacket and a blue scarf around her neck. Her hair was gray and a bit messy, and she looked like she had not slept for a long time. "My name is Clara," she said. She stood up and brushed the dust from her coat. Her hands were shaking. "I am a journalist. Or, I was a journalist. It is hard to remember my old life now." "Why were you hiding under a table?" Sarah asked. She looked around the beautiful, empty dining room. "The food is hot, and the room is warm. It seems safe here. Clara looked toward the kitchen door with a look of terror. The food is a trap, she whispered. She stepped closer to Sarah. It is here to make you stay. If you eat the dinner, you forget where you are going. You forget your name. You forget your family. You become part of the train forever. Sarah looked at the piece of warm bread she almost ate. She immediately dropped it onto the plate. She felt a wave of cold fear in her stomach. I was about to take a bite. She said, "Thank you for warning me." Clara grabbed Sarah's arm. Her fingers were thin but very strong. "You must be very careful. Sarah, this train is hungry. It takes things from people. It took my camera. It took my map. And now, it is trying to take my memories." Sarah looked at the older woman. Clara looked very tired, like she had been running for miles. "How long have you been here?" Sarah asked. Clara opened her notebook. The pages were filled with messy handwriting and strange drawings of the train cars. "I do not know exactly," she said. She looked at the dark windows. "The sun never rises here. It is always night. But I think I have been in this dining carriage for a very long time. I am the only one left." Sarah and Clara sat at a small table, but they did not touch the plates. Sarah looked at the beautiful roasted chicken and the sweet cakes. They looked so real and smelled so good, but now they felt like dangerous objects. Clara held her black notebook tightly against her chest. She looked at the door, then back at Sarah. "I came here to write a story," Clara said. Her voice was a little stronger now. "I was a journalist for a big newspaper in the city. I heard rumors about people disappearing at train stations late at night. They were all looking for a train that did not exist on the official schedule. They were looking for a place called Oakhaven." Sarah's eyes went wide. She felt a shock in her heart. "But Oakhaven is a real place. I live there. I have a small house there. I was just trying to go home after a long day of work." Clara shook her head slowly. Her blue scarf moved with the motion. "The Oakhaven you know is in the real world. But the Oakhaven on this train is different. This train does not go to cities with cars, shops, and busy people. It goes to places that exist only in our memories or our dreams." Sarah felt a cold shiver on her skin. She thought about the dark forest outside and the strange purple stars she saw from the hallway. "How long have you been on this train, Clara?" "You said it has been a long time." "In my notebook, I have marks for 3 days," Clara replied. She opened the book and showed Sarah a page with small lines drawn in ink. "But the clock on the wall of this carriage never moves. My own watch stopped at 11:15. Just like yours. On this train, 3 days can feel like 100 years. Or maybe it is just one very long, dark night that never ends." Sarah looked at the window. The train was moving through a long, grey field now. There were no trees, only flat, dead grass that looked like ash. Does the train ever stop at a real city? Does it ever go back? "It stops at stations with no names," Clara said. "Sometimes people get off the train, but they never come back. I saw a man get off at a station made of white sand. He walked into the dark and disappeared. I was too afraid to follow him. I thought if I stayed on the train, I might find a way home. But now I am not sure." "I saw a conductor," Sarah said. Her voice was very low. "He looked exactly like my grandfather. But my grandfather died 10 years ago. He spoke to me. He told me I should not be here." Clara looked at Sarah with pity in her eyes. "The train knows your heart, Sarah. It shows you what you want to see, or what you are afraid to see. That is how it keeps you here." It makes you feel like you belong to this place." Sarah stood up. She did not want to hear any more. She wanted to find the engine and stop the train. "We have to find the driver," she said. "We have to tell them to stop." Clara looked at the kitchen door. "There is no driver." "Sarah, I went to the front once. The engine room is empty. The train is moving by itself." Sarah could not sit still. Her mind was full of questions. She stood up and walked to a table near the large window. Beside a cold cup of coffee, she saw a newspaper. It was folded neatly. The paper looked very clean and white, as if the delivery man just brought it a few minutes ago. "Is this yours, Clara?" Sarah asked. Clara looked over and shook her head. "No. I saw it there earlier, but I was too afraid to look at it. On this train, information is often a burden." Sarah picked up the newspaper. The paper felt crisp and cool in her hands. She expected to see the date from today, the day she left the city station. But when her eyes found the top corner of the page, she froze. The date was not from the present year. It said, October 25th, 2036. "This is impossible." Sarah whispered. Her hands began to shake. "This is 10 years in the future." She opened the newspaper quickly. The ink was dark and easy to read. She looked at the main page and felt a sharp pain in her chest. There was a large photograph in the center of the page. It was a picture of a house. She recognized the front door and the small garden. It was her house in Oakhaven. But in the photo, the house looked terrible. The windows were broken and dark. The beautiful trees in the garden were dead and gray. There was a tall, metal fence around the property. The headline above the photo said, 10 years later, the mystery of the missing lawyer. Sarah felt like the air left the room. She read the first few sentences. The article spoke about a woman named Sarah who disappeared from a city train station 10 years ago. It said the police never found her. It said her family waited for a long time, but she never came home. Her house was now empty and forgotten. "It is talking about me," Sarah said. She looked at Clara with tears in her eyes. "It says I am gone. It says I disappeared tonight." Clara walked over and put a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "The train does not just travel through the forest, Sarah. It travels through time. To the people in the real world, you are already a memory. But here, you are still alive. You are in a place where the past and the future meet." Sarah dropped the newspaper on the floor. She did not want to see the photo of her broken house anymore. "I am not a memory. I am here. I am real. I have to go back. If I can go back to tonight, I can change this. I can go home to Oakhaven." "Many people try to go back," Clara said softly. "But the train is very strong. It wants to keep its passengers." Suddenly, the lights in the dining carriage began to flicker. A cold wind blew through the room, moving the white tablecloths. Sarah looked toward the door at the far end of the carriage. A tall shadow appeared behind the glass. The shadow behind the glass door grew larger and taller. The flickering lights made the shadow dance on the walls of the dining carriage. Sarah felt her heart jumping in her chest. She looked at Clara, whose face was now as white as the tablecloths. "It is him," Clara whispered. Her voice was so quiet that Sarah could barely hear it. "The man in the grey suit. He is the one who watches everyone. We need to hide," Sarah said. She looked around the room. The tables were too small to hide two people, and the blue curtains were too thin. She looked at the heavy metal door at the back of the carriage. "The kitchen. Let's go." Clara did not wait. She grabbed her black notebook and ran toward the kitchen door. Sarah followed her closely. They pushed the swinging door open and stepped into the dark kitchen. The air inside was cold and smelled of old metal and sharp onions. There were tall silver counters and large pots hanging from the ceiling. Sarah looked back through the small, circular window in the kitchen door. She saw the main door of the dining carriage open slowly. The man in the grey suit stepped inside. He looked exactly the same as before. His suit was perfect, and his eyes were sharp. He walked into the center of the room with slow, calm steps. Sarah and Clara moved behind a large silver counter. They sat on the floor, trying to be as quiet as possible. Sarah could hear Clara's fast breathing. She put a hand on Clara's arm to help her stay calm. In the dining room, the man in the grey suit stopped. Sarah watched him through the gap under the counter. He stood near the table where Sarah was sitting just a minute ago. He looked down at the floor. He saw the impossible newspaper that Sarah dropped. The man reached down and picked up the paper with his thin, gloved fingers. He looked at the photograph of Sarah's broken house. He did not look surprised. He did not look angry. He simply folded the paper neatly and put it under his arm. "I know you are here, Sarah," the man said. His voice was smooth and loud. It echoed in the empty dining room and reached the kitchen. "You cannot hide on a train this small. There are no secrets here. Only memories." Sarah pressed her back against the cold metal of the counter. She closed her eyes and held her breath. She didn't want him to hear her. Beside her, Clara was shaking. The man began to walk again. Sarah heard the rhythmic sound of his polished shoes on the hard floor. He was coming toward the kitchen. The sound became louder and closer. He was almost at the swinging door. Sarah looked at a large, heavy frying pan on the wall. She thought about grabbing it to defend themselves, but her hands felt like lead. Then, the sound of the footsteps stopped. The kitchen door did not open. Instead, Sarah heard the man speak one more time. "Enjoy your dinner, ladies," he said. "But remember, the train does not wait for anyone." Then, Sarah heard the far door of the carriage open and close. The silence returned to the room, heavier than before. Sarah and Clara stayed on the floor for a long time. They did not move and they did not speak. The only sound was the steady, heavy rhythm of the train wheels hitting the tracks below them. After many minutes, the silence in the dining room felt safe again. Sarah stood up slowly. Her legs felt stiff and cold from the kitchen floor. "He is gone," Sarah whispered. Clara stood up too. She was still holding her notebook. "He is never really gone, Sarah. He is part of the train. But he is not in this carriage now." Sarah looked around the dark kitchen. It was a strange place. There were many cupboards and drawers, but most of them were empty. She felt a strong desire to find something, anything, that could explain why she was here. She walked toward a small cupboard near the back of the kitchen. It was hidden behind a stack of silver trays. She opened the cupboard. Inside, there was a small box made of dark, heavy wood. It was covered in a thick layer of dust. Sarah pulled the box out and placed it on the metal counter. The box made a light tapping sound against the silver surface. It felt very old, and it smelled like cedar wood and dry paper. "What is that?" Clara asked, coming closer. "I don't know," Sarah said. She wiped the dust away with her sleeve. There was no lock on the box. She lifted the lid slowly. The hinges of the box made a long, thin creaking sound that seemed to fill the quiet room. Inside the box, there were hundreds of small photographs. They were all black and white, and the edges were yellow with age. Sarah picked up a handful of them. The photos showed people sitting in the train carriages. There were men in tall hats, women in long dresses, and workers in uniforms. All of the people looked very serious. None of them were smiling. "These are the passengers," Clara said softly. She looked at a photo of a man sitting by a window. The ones who came before us. The ones the train kept. Sarah looked at the photos one by one. Each person had a small name and a date written on the back in black ink. Some of the dates were from the year 1920. Some were from 1950. Some were from the future, like the newspaper she saw earlier. The train collects them. Sarah said. She felt a deep sadness. It doesn't just collect their time. It collects their faces. It collects their lives. She reached deeper into the box. Her fingers touched a photo that felt different. It was newer than the others. She pulled it out and held it near the small light above the counter. When she saw the face in the photograph, she felt a cold shock. Her hands began to shake again. "Clara, look at this," Sarah said. Her voice was almost a whisper. Clara looked at the photo and gasped. She looked at the photo, and then she looked at Sarah. The woman in the picture was standing on the platform of a station. She was wearing a professional suit and carrying a leather bag. She looked confident and happy. It was a photo of Sarah. But in the picture, Sarah looked much older. She had small lines around her eyes and a few grey hairs. It was a version of Sarah that did not exist yet. Sarah held the photograph tightly. Her fingers were white because she was squeezing the paper so hard. The woman in the picture looked back at her with a sad, quiet smile. It was definitely her. She had the same shape of the nose and the same eyes. But this Sarah was older. There were small wrinkles around her eyes, and her hair was tied back in a way Sarah never wore it. "I don't understand," Sarah said. Her voice was very thin. "I am 30 years old. This woman is 50. Maybe more. How can there be a photo of me from the future?" Clara leaned over and looked at the background of the photo. She pointed a finger at a small, wooden gate behind the older Sarah. "Look at the house. It is the same house from the newspaper. Your house in Oakhaven. But in this photo, the garden is full of flowers. It looks like a happy home." Sarah looked closer. It was true. The house looked beautiful and warm. It was not the broken, dark house from the missing lawyer article. This version of the future was different. "On this train," Clara said softly, "there are many paths. The newspaper showed you one path. The path where you disappear and never return. This photo shows a different path. Maybe it is a path where you stay here for a long time and then finally go back. But I don't want to stay here for 20 years. Sarah cried. She felt a sudden wave of anger. She didn't like the train playing games with her life. She didn't like the man in the grey suit watching her. She wanted to be in control again. She turned the photo over. On the back, there was no date. Instead, there was a single word written in the same elegant, black ink. "Choice. Choice." Sarah read aloud. "What choice? I didn't choose to be on this train. I just wanted to go home." Clara looked at the box of photographs. She began to move her hands through the hundreds of faces. Everyone here made a choice. Sarah. Some chose to leave. Some chose to stay. Some were too afraid to choose at all, so the train chose for them. Sarah put the photo in her pocket, next to the golden watch. She felt a new strength in her heart. She was a lawyer. She was good at solving problems. She was good at finding the truth. She was not going to let a mysterious train decide her future. "I'm going to the front of the train," Sarah said. Her voice was firm now. The man in the grey suit said it was close. "The note told me not to go. But I have to. I have to find out who is driving this train and how to stop it." Clara looked afraid, but she stood up straight. "I will come with you. I have been hiding in this dining carriage for too long. If I stay here, I will eventually become a photo in that box too. The two women walked out of the kitchen and back into the dining room. The food on the tables was still steaming, but they ignored it. They walked toward the far door. As they reached it, the train began to tilt again. The floor moved under their feet, and the lights in the ceiling began to glow with a strange, deep purple color. Sarah and Clara moved toward the door at the end of the dining carriage. The purple light from the ceiling was very bright now. It made everything look strange and cold. Sarah felt a heavy pressure in her ears, like she was deep under the ocean. The train was moving faster than ever. The rhythmic sound of the wheels became a single, long roar that echoed through the walls. Just as Sarah reached for the door handle, the world outside the window changed. The purple sky and the grey fields disappeared instantly. The train entered a tunnel. It was not a normal tunnel made of stone or brick. This tunnel was perfectly black. There were no lights on the walls and no end in sight. Suddenly, all the lights in the carriage went out. The darkness was total. Sarah could not see her own hands. She could not see Clara, even though the woman was standing right next to her. She felt a wave of panic. In the city, there was always some light from the street or the moon. But here, the darkness was thick and heavy. It felt like a physical weight pressing against her skin. "Clara!" Sarah shouted. Her voice was swallowed by the loud, echoing noise of the tunnel. "I am here, Sarah." Clara's voice sounded far away, even though she was close. "Do not move. Stay exactly where you are." Sarah reached out her hand into the empty air. She felt the cold metal of a table, then the soft fabric of a chair. Finally, her fingers touched a sleeve. It was Clara's arm. Sarah held on tightly. She did not want to be alone in this black void. "Don't let go," Sarah whispered. The train began to shake violently. It felt like the tracks were not straight anymore. They were turning and twisting in the dark. Sarah felt the golden pocket watch in her pocket. It was glowing very faintly through the fabric of her coat. The warmth from the watch was the only thing that kept her from screaming. "The tunnel is long," Clara said. Her voice was shaking. "I remember this from my notes. This is the place where the train changes. It is the bridge between the past and the future." The air in the carriage became very windy. A cold breeze blew through the dark room, even though the windows were closed. It smelled of wet earth and old metal. Sarah felt like there were other people in the room with them. She felt the movement of shadows passing by her, but she could see nothing. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked. "I hear only the train," Clara replied. But Sarah heard more. She heard soft whispers that sounded like many people talking at the same time. She could not understand the words, but the voices sounded sad. They were the voices of the people from the box of photographs. The train made a loud, grinding noise as it began to slow down. The heavy pressure in Sarah's ears started to go away. In the distance, she saw a tiny point of light. It was the end of the tunnel. "We are almost through," Sarah said, squeezing Clara's arm. The point of light grew larger and brighter. It was a cold, white light that hurt her eyes after the long darkness. The train moved forward with a final, sudden jump. The white light was very strong. Sarah had to close her eyes for a moment. She felt the train move out of the dark tunnel and back onto the open tracks. The loud, roaring noise stopped. Everything became very quiet. The yellow lamps on the ceiling turned on one by one, filling the dining carriage with a soft glow. Sarah opened her eyes and blinked. She felt the cold metal of the door handle in her right hand. She remembered holding Clara's arm with her left hand in the dark. She looked down at her left hand, but it was empty. She was holding nothing but the air. "Clara," Sarah said. Her voice sounded very loud in the silent room. She turned around and looked at the dining carriage. The tables were still there, perfectly set. The food was still hot, and the steam rose slowly from the bowls. The crystal glasses were shining. But Clara was gone. She was not near the door. She was not at the table. She was not behind the kitchen counter. Clara! Where are you? Sarah ran to the kitchen. She pushed the swinging door with both hands. The kitchen was empty and cold. The dark wooden box of photos was still on the silver counter. But the journalist was missing. Sarah looked everywhere. She looked under the large tables and behind the blue silk curtains. No one was there. Sarah walked back to the middle of the dining room. She felt a heavy weight of fear in her chest. She did not want to be alone on this mysterious train. She looked at the floor near the center table. She saw something bright and blue on the carpet. She walked over and picked it up. It was Clara's blue scarf. The fabric was soft and smelled like lavender and old books. Sarah held it tightly in her hands. It was still a little warm, as if Clara just took it off a second ago. She was right here. Sarah whispered. I was holding her arm. I felt her jacket. She remembered the strange whispers she heard in the tunnel. She remembered the feeling of people passing by in the dark. Did the shadows take Clara? Or did Clara reach her destination while the lights were out? Sarah did not know the answer. She felt very small and very lonely. She felt a tear move down her cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her hand. She was the only passenger left in this part of the train. She looked out the window. The landscape was new again. Outside, there was only white snow. There were no trees, no hills, and no buildings. The sky was black and had no stars. It looked like the end of the world. Sarah realized she had to be brave. She could not stay in the dining room forever. She had to find the front of the train and talk to the architect or the conductor. She put Clara's blue scarf around her own neck and tied it gently. It was a memory of her friend. She looked at the golden watch. The time was still 11:15. She walked to the far door and took a deep breath. She was ready to find the next part of the mystery. She pushed the door open and stepped into the next carriage. Sarah stood by the door of the dining carriage. She held Clara's blue scarf tightly. The fabric felt like a part of her friend was still with her. She was very sad that Clara was gone, but she also felt a new sense of purpose. Clara was a journalist. She looked for facts. Sarah was a lawyer. She looked for evidence. She decided to examine the scarf carefully. She moved back to a table and sat down. She spread the blue scarf out on the white tablecloth. She looked at every inch of the material. It was a simple scarf. But then she noticed something strange. One corner of the scarf felt thicker than the rest. There was a tiny, hidden pocket sewn into the edge of the fabric. Sarah used her fingers to feel the small bump inside the pocket. She carefully pulled the threads apart. A small, white piece of paper fell out. It was folded into a tiny square. Sarah opened it. There were no names and no long messages. There were only 3 characters written in very small, neat handwriting. 12B. 12B. Sarah said aloud. It is a seat number. She remembered the passenger list she saw in the box of photos. Every person on this train had a place. If Clara left this note, it meant that seat 12B was important. Perhaps there was a clue there. Or perhaps that was where Clara was taken. Sarah stood up and put the note in her pocket with the golden watch and the photograph. She put the blue scarf around her neck and tied it. She felt a little warmer and more confident. She walked to the heavy door at the end of the dining room and pushed it open. The next carriage was very different. It was a standard passenger carriage, but it looked very old. There were 2 rows of seats with a narrow aisle in the middle. The seats were made of dark green leather. Above the seats, there were small brass plates with numbers on them. The air here was thin and smelled like dust and old smoke. Sarah began to walk down the aisle. She looked at the numbers on the left side. 1A, 2A, 3A. The carriage was empty of people, but many of the seats had items on them. On seat 4A, there was a pair of old glasses. On seat 7A, there was a single leather glove. It felt like the people just stepped away for a moment and would be back soon. The train made a long, low groaning sound as it turned a corner. Sarah held onto the back of a seat to stay steady. She reached the middle of the carriage. Her heart began to beat faster. She saw the number 11. And then she saw it. 12B. Seat 12B was on the right side, near the window. Unlike the other seats, this one was not empty. There was a large, heavy leather bag sitting on the green cushion. The bag was old and had many travel stickers on it from places Sarah did not recognize. Sarah stood in the aisle and looked at the bag. She looked around the carriage once more to make sure she was alone. The only sound was the wind hitting the outside of the train. She reached out her hand to touch the bag. Just as her fingers touched the leather, the train entered another small tunnel, and the carriage became dark for a second. The train came out of the short tunnel. The soft yellow light returned to the carriage. Sarah looked at the heavy leather bag on seat 12B. Her heart was beating fast. She slowly opened the metal buckles of the bag. Inside, she did not find gold or clothes. She found a dark blue uniform jacket. It was exactly like the one the conductor was wearing. Sarah pulled the jacket out. It was heavy and smelled of cold air and old tobacco. On the front of the jacket, there was a small silver name tag. It said, H. Miller, Henry Miller. Sarah whispered her grandfather's name. She reached into the pockets of the jacket. In the right pocket, she found a heavy brass key. It was much larger than the silver key from the watch. Attached to the key was a small wooden tag with one word written on it. Office. Sarah knew she had to find this office. She stood up and walked to the front of the carriage. She passed through another heavy door and found herself in a small, narrow hallway. The walls here were made of dark metal. At the very end of the hallway, there was a single door. It did not have a number. It had a small glass window, but the glass was painted black so no one could see inside. Sarah walked to the door. She tried the handle, but it was locked. She took the brass key from the jacket pocket and put it into the lock. She turned the key slowly. The lock made a heavy, metallic sound. The door moved open a few inches. Sarah pushed the door open and stepped inside. This was the conductor's office. The room was very small and very messy. There was a small wooden desk in the corner and a single chair. The walls were covered with hundreds of small hooks. On each hook, there was a different ticket. Some were white, some were red, and some were gold like Sarah's ticket. On the desk, there was a large book. It was open to the middle. Sarah walked over and looked at the pages. The book was a log of the train's journey. It listed dates and times, but the years were all different. One line said 1944, and the next line said 2050. Next to the book, there was a small, framed photograph. Sarah picked it up. In the photo, a young man was standing in front of a bakery. He was smiling and holding a loaf of bread. It was her grandfather, Henry, when he was young. Behind him, Sarah saw a younger version of the man in the grey suit. They were standing together like friends. Sarah felt a wave of confusion. Why was the architect in a photo with her grandfather from 50 years ago? She looked around the office for more clues. Above the desk, there was a large map pinned to the wall. It was not a map of a country. It was a map of the train itself. Sarah looked at the map and saw that the train was much longer than she thought. There were carriages she had not seen yet. But the most strange thing was the shape of the tracks on the map. They did not go from one city to another. Sarah stood very still in the small office. She looked at the map on the wall. It was an old map, and the paper was yellow. At the top of the map, there were gold letters that said, "The Infinite Line." Sarah expected to see a map of the country. She wanted to see the mountains, the rivers, and the cities. But there were no cities on this map. There were no names of places she knew. There was no London, no Paris, and no Oakhaven. Instead, the map showed a single line of train tracks. The tracks did not go from the left side of the paper to the right. They did not have a beginning and they did not have an end. The tracks formed a perfect, giant circle. "It is a loop," Sarah whispered. Her voice sounded hollow in the small room. She followed the line with her finger. The line moved through a dark area marked the Forest of Shadows. Then it moved through a white area called the Frozen Waste. After that, it passed through a purple area called the Sky Bridge. Finally, it came back to the start. The train was not going anywhere. It was just moving around and around in a circle forever. Sarah looked for stations on the map. Usually, a train map has small dots for stations. This map had dots, but the names were very strange. One dot was called Regret. Another was called Lost Dreams. A third was called The First Memory. "This is not a real train," Sarah said. She felt a cold ball of fear in her stomach. "It's a prison." She looked at the bottom of the map. There was a small note written in pencil. It was very hard to read. It said, "The only way out is to stop the circle." Sarah looked back at the large logbook on the desk. She turned the pages quickly. She saw her own name written on the last page. Next to her name, there was a time, 11:15. Below her name, the book was empty. There were no more passengers after her. Suddenly, the floor of the office began to vibrate. It was not the usual movement of the train. It was a heavy, rhythmic shaking. Sarah looked at the small window in the door. The black paint was starting to crack. Through the cracks, she saw a bright light moving in the hallway. She realized she could not stay in the office. The architect or the conductor would come back soon. She took the brass key and put it in her pocket. She looked at the map one last time. She needed to find the center of that circle. If the train was moving in a loop, there must be a way to break the tracks. She moved to the door and listened. She did not hear any footsteps, but she felt a strange presence outside. The air in the office became very thin and hard to breathe. She grabbed the handle and prepared to run. She did not know where she was going, but she knew she could not stay in the circle anymore. She had to find the truth about her grandfather and the man in the gray suit. Sarah pushed the door of the office open and stepped back into the narrow hallway. She moved quietly, hoping no one would hear her. She still had the brass key in her hand. She put it deep into her pocket. The air in the hallway was very cold now, and the metal walls felt like ice. She did not get far. At the end of the hallway, a man was standing in her path. He was not the conductor, and he was not the man in the gray suit. This man was very wide and very tall. He wore a heavy, dark coat that looked almost black. On his head was a stiff, flat cap. His face was hard and stern, like it was carved from a piece of old wood. He held a large metal puncher in his hand. "Ticket, please," the man said. His voice was not smooth like the architect's. It was loud and sounded like stones hitting a metal floor. Sarah stopped. She felt a wave of fear. "Who are you?" she asked. "I am Mr. Henderson," the man replied. He did not smile. He did not move. "I am the ticket collector. Every passenger must have a valid ticket. No one travels for free on the Infinite Line." Sarah reached into her pocket. Her fingers touched the gold pocket watch and the silver key before she found the gold-edged ticket. She pulled it out and held it toward him. Her hand was shaking a little bit. Mr. Henderson took the ticket with a large, heavy hand. He did not look at Sarah. He held the ticket up to the flickering light of the hallway. He looked at the gold edges and the elegant black ink. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small magnifying glass. He examined the ticket for a long time. "This is an old ticket," Mr. Henderson said. He looked at Sarah with his small, dark eyes. "Where did you get this? This type of ticket hasn't been used for many, many years." "A man gave it to me at the station," Sarah said. "The man in the blue uniform. He said it was my ticket." Mr. Henderson made a low, angry noise in his throat. "The conductor is too kind. He gives things away. But the rules are the rules. A ticket must be punched at the start of every cycle." He took his metal puncher and pressed it against the gold card. A sharp, metallic sound filled the hallway. He handed the ticket back to Sarah. In the corner of the card, there was now a small hole in the shape of a star. "Now you are a real passenger," Mr. Henderson said. He stepped aside to let her pass, but he did not move his eyes from her face. "But remember, a ticket only allows you to ride. It does not allow you to enter private offices. If I see you near the conductor's desk again, I will put you in the luggage carriage." Sarah walked past him as fast as she could. She could feel his eyes on her back. She did not look behind her until she reached the door to the next carriage. She felt like the train was becoming a more dangerous place every minute. The ticket collector was not a friend. He was a guard. Sarah fled from the heavy gaze of the ticket collector, her boots clicking rapidly on the metal floor. She pushed through the door at the end of the hallway and stopped dead. If the previous carriages were echoes of a grand hotel or a library, this one was a nightmare of engineering. The room was filled with the sound of 1,000 ticking clocks. Large, brass gears turned slowly in the walls, their teeth gnashing together with a heavy, oily rhythm. Steam hissed from thin pipes that crisscrossed the ceiling like a spiderweb. The air was thick and smelled of hot copper and ozone. In the center of the carriage was a giant, glass cylinder that stretched from the floor to the ceiling. Inside the glass, a golden pendulum swung back and forth. But it didn't swing freely. It seemed to be fighting against the air, moving in slow motion. Every time it reached the edge of the glass, the entire train shuddered. "It is quite beautiful, isn't it?" Sarah jumped. Sitting at a small, glass desk near the cylinder was the man in the grey suit. He was holding a tiny screwdriver, working on the inner parts of a pocket watch, one that looked exactly like the one in Sarah's pocket. "You," Sarah said, her voice tightening. She adjusted Clara's blue scarf around her neck. "The ticket collector said I'm a real passenger now. He punched my ticket. Tell me what is happening. Why is my grandfather here? Why is the map a circle?" The architect laid down his tools and looked up. For the first time, he looked tired. "The circle is the only thing keeping the world from falling apart. Sarah, outside this train, time is a river that flows to a waterfall. Here, we have captured it. We have made it a lake. A lake where everyone is a prisoner." Sarah stepped closer to the glass cylinder. "I saw a newspaper from 10 years in the future. My house is a ruin. People think I'm dead. That isn't a lake, it's a grave." The man in the grey suit stood up. He walked toward her, his movements fluid and precise. "The future is a matter of perspective. You saw one version. The photograph you found, the one of the older you in the garden, that is another. This machine," he gestured to the glass cylinder, "is the heart. It maintains the 11:15 loop. As long as it ticks, you are safe from the waterfall of the real world." Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out the golden watch. The metal was burning hot now. The conductor, my grandfather, he told me to keep this. He said it knows the truth about time. If I break the loop, what happens? The architect's eyes flashed with a sudden, sharp intensity. If you stop the heart, the train stops. The circle breaks. You will be cast back into the now, but you will have been gone for 10 years in the real world. You will be a ghost in your own life. He pointed to the star-shaped hole in her ticket. You have been marked. Sarah, you can stay here and live forever in the safety of 1115. Or you can go back to a world that has forgotten you. Sarah looked at the swinging pendulum. She thought of Clara, of her grandfather's sad eyes, and of the empty desk at her law firm. She felt the weight of the brass key in her pocket. I don't belong in a loop, she whispered. The architect watched her with a cold, analytical curiosity. He didn't move to stop her. He didn't call for the ticket collector. He simply leaned against his glass desk, crossing his arms over his perfect grey suit. You are a lawyer, Sarah, he said softly. You of all people should understand the value of a settled agreement. The loop is a contract. It offers safety in exchange for repetition. You are choosing chaos over order. Sarah looked at the golden watch in her hand. The metal was so hot now that it felt like a living coal. She felt the weight of everything she had gathered on this impossible journey. The golden watch, a device that mirrored the train's frozen time. The silver key, found hidden within the watch's face. The brass key, taken from the conductor's, her grandfather's, jacket. The blue scarf, a reminder of Clara and the others lost to the loop. The ticket, now marked with a star, a sign of her permanent status. I spent my life fighting for the truth in courtrooms. Sarah replied, her voice gaining strength. A contract signed in the dark, without knowing the terms, is no contract at all. You didn't give me a choice, you gave me a trap. She stepped toward the giant glass cylinder. The golden pendulum inside continued its slow, agonized swing. She could see the complex clockwork beneath the floorboards, a massive arrangement of gears and springs that regulated the heart. Sarah noticed a small, silver indentation at the base of the glass cylinder, the exact size of the silver key. She realized then that her grandfather hadn't just given her a watch, he had given her the off switch. He had been the conductor of her prison, and he had finally decided to help her escape. If you do this, the architect warned, stepping forward now, his calm facade finally cracking. The 1115 loop will shatter. The train will enter the stream of real time. You will face the 10 years you've lost. You will be alone. I was alone in the loop, Sarah countered. At least in the real world, the sun eventually rises. She inserted the silver key into the base of the heart. It fit perfectly. With a deep breath, she turned it. The reaction was immediate. A high-pitched whine, like a million tea kettles screaming at once, filled the carriage. The golden pendulum jerked violently, swinging outside its slow-motion path and slamming against the glass. Cracks spider-webbed across the cylinder. The ticking of the 1,000 clocks in the room sped up, becoming a frantic, deafening blur of sound. The architect reached out as if to grab her, but he seemed to be fading. His grey suit was becoming transparent, his sharp features blurring into the shadows of the room. The waterfall, he whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves. It's coming. The glass cylinder exploded. Shards of crystal flew through the air like diamonds, but they didn't fall. They floated, suspended in a sudden lack of gravity. The train gave a monstrous lurch, a sound of grinding metal so loud it felt like the earth was splitting open. Sarah grabbed the brass rail, her knuckles white, as the purple light of the carriage was replaced by a blinding, pure white flash. The white light didn't burn. It felt like a cool, deep breath after being underwater for a long time. The screaming of the metal and the ticking of the 1,000 clocks faded into a profound, heavy silence. Sarah felt herself falling, not down, but out, as if she were stepping through a thin curtain of silk. When she opened her eyes, she was lying on a hard, wooden bench. The air didn't smell like ozone and hot copper anymore. It smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and the sharp, clean scent of a coming winter rain. The perpetual night of the train was gone. In its place was a soft, grey dawn, with the first light of morning peeking through a thick blanket of mist. Sarah sat up slowly. Her body felt heavy and stiff, a deep ache in her joints that hadn't been there when she first boarded the train. She looked at her hands. They were the hands from the photograph, the skin a little thinner, the knuckles more prominent. She touched her face and felt the faint lines around her eyes. She was at the Oakhaven station. But it was a ghost of the place she remembered. The Oakhaven sign was peeling, hanging by a single rusted bolt. The tracks were almost invisible, hidden under 10 years of tall, yellow weeds and wild vines. The bright, modern platform was cracked, and the digital displays were dark and shattered. She reached into her pocket. Her fingers found 3 things. The golden watch. Its glass face was shattered, but the hands were finally moving. It was 6:14 a.m. The brass key. The conductor's key. Cold and heavy. The ticket. It was no longer gold-edged. It was a simple, faded piece of grey cardboard. She stood up, her legs trembling slightly. Wrapped around her neck was Clara's blue scarf, its lavender scent faint but real. It wasn't a dream. The loop had taken a decade of her life, but it hadn't taken her soul. Sarah walked toward the station exit. The town of Oakhaven looked different in the distance. There were new buildings, taller and sleeker, and the hum of the distant highway sounded different, quieter, more electric. She felt like a traveler from a different century. As she reached the edge of the platform, she saw a small, weathered wooden bench where an old man was sitting, reading a digital tablet. He looked up as she approached. His eyes widened, and he dropped the tablet. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Sarah Miller. Is that really you?" Sarah recognized him. It was Mr. Gable, the baker who used to work for her grandfather. He was much older now, his hair completely white. "Yes, Mr. Gable," Sarah said, her voice sounding strange and new to her own ears. "I've been away for a while. 10 years. The old man breathed, standing up with difficulty. "You disappeared on the 11:15. We looked for so long. Your mother, she never stopped hoping." Sarah felt a tear slip down her cheek. But she was smiling. The architect was wrong. The waterfall wasn't a grave. It was a beginning. She had lost time, but she had found her way back to the only thing that mattered, the truth. She looked back at the rusted tracks one last time. There was no train. There was only the mist and the rising sun. Sarah turned away from the station and began the long walk home. The walk from the station into the heart of Oakhaven felt like walking through a dream of her own life. Every few steps, Sarah recognized a landmark, the old oak tree near the library, the stone bridge over the creek, but they were all subtly altered. The tree was much larger, its branches heavy and sagging. The bridge had been reinforced with modern steel railings. As she reached the main street, the changes became more jarring. The small, family-owned hardware store where her grandfather used to buy his tools was now a sleek, glass-fronted pharmacy. The local diner, which always smelled of burnt coffee and maple syrup, had been replaced by a smart cafe where people stood in silence, staring at holographic displays hovering over their tables. Sarah felt like a ghost haunting the living. She looked down at her clothes. Her professional suit from a decade ago was dusty, wrinkled, and hopelessly out of style. Around her, people moved with a frantic energy. They wore lightweight, shimmering fabrics and spoke into tiny earpieces that seemed to be part of their jewelry. No one looked at her. In a world of high-speed connectivity, a woman walking slowly in a tattered coat was just background noise. She stopped in front of a digital kiosk in the town square. A bright, rotating advertisement showed the date. January 25th, 2036. It was exactly 10 years to the day since she had stepped onto that platform in the city. 10 years. She whispered, the words puffing out in the cold morning air. I haven't just lost time. I've lost a version of the world. She felt the golden watch in her pocket. It was the only thing that felt solid in this strange new reality. Even though its glass was shattered, the internal mechanism was ticking with a loud, rhythmic pulse that she could feel against her hip. It wasn't just a watch anymore. It felt like a tether, keeping her anchored to her own history. Sarah reached a small park where she used to sit and read her law briefs. In the center stood a new monument, a simple stone pillar. She walked toward it, her heart sinking. On the side of the stone, engraved in a long list of names, she found what she was looking for. Under the heading that disappeared, her own name was etched into the rock. Sarah Miller. Seeing her name on a memorial triggered a sharp, cold realization. To the world, she was a tragedy. She was a cold case. She was a story parents told their children to make them stay close at train stations. I'm not a story, she said to the stone, her voice gaining a sharp edge of anger. I'm still here. She turned away from the monument and headed toward the residential district. She knew exactly where she was going. She needed to know if the house from the photograph was real, if the happy, flower-filled garden was a possibility or just another lie told by the architect. Sarah's feet moved by instinct as she turned onto Willow Lane. This was the street where she had grown up, where every crack in the sidewalk was familiar. But as she approached her family home, her heart began to hammer against her ribs. The house was there. It wasn't the ruin she had seen in the newspaper from the future. It was well maintained, painted a soft cream color with dark blue shutters. The garden was sleeping under a layer of frost, but she could see the neatly trimmed rose bushes and the sturdy wooden fence she had helped her grandfather repair when she was a teenager. She stood at the gate, her hand trembling on the latch. This was the moment she had dreamed of in the freezing hallways of the train, the moment that had kept her moving through the dining carriage and the conductor's office. But now that she was here, she was terrified. What if her mother had moved away? What if someone else lived here now? The front door opened. A woman stepped out onto the porch to pick up a delivery package. She was older, her hair a silver-white crown, and she moved with a slight limp. She wore a thick knitted sweater that Sarah recognized. It was one her mother had started knitting weeks before Sarah disappeared. Mom. The word was so quiet it was barely a breath. The woman froze. She didn't look up at first. She stayed bent over the package, her hand frozen on the cardboard. She remained like that for 5 long seconds, as if the sound of Sarah's voice was a ghost she had heard 1,000 times in her sleep. Slowly, painfully, she stood up and looked toward the gate. When their eyes met, the world seemed to stop. The 10 years of silence, the police reports, the funerals without a body, it all collapsed into a single point of time. Her mother's face went through a kaleidoscope of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, a raw, primal recognition. Sarah. The woman whispered. The package slipped from her fingers, hitting the porch. Sarah didn't wait for another word. She pushed the gate open and ran. She felt like the 30-year-old woman she was, and the 10-year-old child she used to be, all at once. She reached the porch and collapsed into her mother's arms. The embrace was solid. It was real. It didn't smell like old metal or cold steam. It smelled of lavender soap and home. They stood there on the porch, 2 women held together by a miracle, crying silently as the sun finally broke through the morning mist. You're cold. Her mother sobbed, pulling back to look at Sarah's face. She touched the blue scarf around Sarah's neck. You're so cold, my baby. Where have you been? I was on a train. Mom. Sarah said, her voice breaking. A train that didn't know how to stop. The kitchen of her childhood home was exactly as she remembered, yet entirely different. There were new appliances, a fridge that talked to the grocery store, a stove that used induction magnets, but the old wooden table still had the scratch Sarah had made with a fork when she was 6. Her mother, Martha, sat across from her, clutching a mug of tea as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. She couldn't stop looking at Sarah, her eyes tracing every line of her daughter's face. The police are coming, Martha said softly. And Dr. Aries. I called them as soon as we got inside. They didn't believe me at first. They thought I was having another episode. I'm sorry I put you through that, Sarah said, reaching across the table to take her mother's hand. Her hand felt young and strong compared to her mother's paper-thin skin. A few minutes later, the house was filled with people. 2 officers stood in the kitchen, looking uncomfortable and bewildered. Then came Dr. Aries, a man who had been the family physician for decades. He looked at Sarah like she was a specimen from another planet. It's impossible, Aries muttered as he took Sarah's pulse. He checked her eyes with a light and listened to her heart. Sarah, according to our records, you disappeared in 2026. You were 30 years old. You should be 40 today. Sarah nodded. I know, but I don't feel 40. That's the thing, Aries said, his voice dropping to a whisper. You don't look 40 either. You look exactly as you did in the photos from the day you went missing. Maybe a few months older at most. Your cellular health, your skin elasticity, it's as if time simply didn't touch you for a decade. One of the police officers, a younger man who hadn't been on the force when Sarah disappeared, leaned against the counter. So, where were you? We searched every inch of the rail lines between the city and Oakhaven. We checked hospitals, morgues, even cults. You weren't anywhere. I was on the train, Sarah repeated. She knew how crazy it sounded. The 11:15. It didn't go to Oakhaven. It went into the woods, and then it went somewhere else. There were others there. A man in a grey suit. A woman named Clara. The officers exchanged a look. The 11:15 was decommissioned 8 years ago. The older one said, after your disappearance and 3 others, they closed that line. The tracks are overgrown. The station in the city was torn down. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out the shattered golden watch. She placed it on the wooden table. The sound of its ticking was suddenly very loud in the quiet kitchen. The tracks might be gone, Sarah said, her eyes meeting the doctor's. But the time is still moving. And I think I brought a piece of it back with me. As if in response, the watch gave a sharp sound. The broken hands, which had been moving normally, suddenly spun backward 3 times and stopped. The world of 2036 was loud, bright, and overwhelmingly fast. But for Sarah, the most unsettling thing was the silence of her own bedroom. As the police and the doctor finally left, leaving her alone with her mother, she retreated to the space she hadn't seen in a decade. Sarah's bedroom was a time capsule. Her mother had kept it exactly as it was, the law textbooks on the shelf, the dried flowers from a graduation bouquet, the old computer monitor that now looked like an ancient relic. But as Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, the room didn't feel stable. She felt a phantom vibration beneath her feet. It was the low, rhythmic hum of wheels on tracks. She gripped the edge of her mattress, expecting the walls to tilt or a blue silk curtain to flutter in a sudden draft. But the walls remained still. The only sound was the distant, high-pitched drone of a neighbor's automated lawnmower. It's just my mind, she whispered. I'm on solid ground. But then, she looked at the glass of water her mother had left on the nightstand. The surface of the water was rippling. It wasn't the slow, concentric circles caused by a heavy truck passing by outside. It was a rapid, rhythmic pulsing, the exact frequency of the train's engine. Sarah watched, mesmerized and terrified, as a small puff of white mist escaped her mouth. The room temperature hadn't dropped, but the mist was there. It was a piece of the forest of shadows clinging to her lungs. She realized then that the architect's warning hadn't been an empty threat. You don't just leave the infinite line. It stays in your blood. She reached for the golden watch on the nightstand. It was silent now, the hands frozen at 11:15. But it felt heavy, impossibly heavy, like it was made of the same dark matter as the tunnel. "Sarah, are you hungry?" Her mother called from downstairs. Sarah tried to answer, but her voice felt caught in a different time. She looked in the mirror above her dresser. For a split second, her reflection didn't show her bedroom behind her. It showed the dining carriage. She saw the white tablecloths, the steaming soup, and for a heartbeat, the flickering shadow of the man in the grey suit standing right behind her. She blinked, and the image vanished. Her room was back, but the lavender scent of Clara's scarf, which she had draped over a chair, had grown stronger, almost suffocating. The scarf wasn't just a souvenir. It was a beacon. I didn't break the loop. Sarah realized, her heart racing. I just dragged a piece of it back with me. She stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was bright, but the shadows of the trees looked too long, too thin. They looked like the reaching fingers of the trees in the forest. She wasn't just home, she was a bridge between two worlds, and the train was still looking for its missing passenger. Sleep was impossible. Every time Sarah closed her eyes, she heard the ticket collector's heavy puncher in the hallway. By midnight, she gave up and began to search through her old belongings, looking for anything that might explain why her grandfather, a simple baker, had been the conductor of a ghost train. She pulled out a box of old letters from the back of her closet. Most were mundane: birthday cards, old utility bills, letters from law school friends. But at the very bottom, tucked inside a hollowed-out book about Victorian history, she found a small, black envelope. It had no stamp and no address. Inside was a single piece of heavy, gold-edged cardstock. Sarah's breath hitched. It was a ticket. But it wasn't like her gold ticket. This one was deep, midnight blue. The ink was silver, and it didn't say Oakhaven or the Silver Valley. It said, "The architect's private box." On the back of the ticket, there was a handwritten note in her grandfather's neat, sharp script. "Sarah, if you are reading this, I have failed to keep the door closed. The gold watch is a key, but the blue ticket is a choice. Do not trust the man who speaks of lakes and waterfalls. He is the one who built the dam." The date on the note was January 24th, 2026, the day before she disappeared. He knew. Sarah whispered, clutching the blue ticket. "He knew it was coming for me." She remembered her grandfather's face in the conductor's office. He hadn't just been a prisoner, he had been a guardian. He had taken the job of conductor to try and steer the train away from her. But something had gone wrong. The architect had won, and Henry Miller had been forced to watch his own granddaughter board the very train he was trying to stop. Suddenly, a cold wind blew through the closed window. The blue ticket in her hand began to glow with a faint, silvery light. Sarah felt the brass key in her pocket grow cold. A soft tapping sound came from the bedroom door. Tap, 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 tap. It wasn't her mother's knock. It was a rhythmic, mechanical sound. Sarah stood up, the blue ticket held tight in her hand. She walked to the door and opened it. But the hallway was empty. Her mother was asleep downstairs. The house should have been silent. Then she looked down. Sitting on the carpet right outside her door was a small, silver tool, the same one the conductor had used to check the tracks. Beside it lay a small piece of paper with a single word printed in black ink. Reclamation. The train wasn't just a memory. It was coming back to collect the debt of the 10 years she had stolen from the loop. And this time, it wouldn't need a station to find her. The next morning, Sarah decided she couldn't stay hidden in her house. If the train was following her, she needed to see how far its influence reached into the new Oakhaven. She wrapped Clara's blue scarf around her neck and stepped out into the crisp, high-tech world of 2036. She walked toward the town square, her eyes scanning the crowds. People were busy, their eyes glued to holographic interfaces or deep in conversation with invisible AI assistants. To them, she was just another person. But Sarah saw the glitches. As she passed the smart cafe, the holographic menu flickered. For a second, the digital images of lattes and pastries were replaced by the roasted chicken and sweet cakes of the dining carriage. No one else noticed. They continued to order their synthetic drinks, oblivious to the trap food appearing in their displays. Sarah stopped at the park monument again. Standing by the stone pillar was a man. He wore a perfectly tailored grey suit that looked out of place among the shimmering, modern fabrics of the other citizens. He wasn't looking at the names. He was looking directly at her. It wasn't the architect. This man was younger, perhaps in his late 20s, but he had the same tea-colored eyes and the same unnerving stillness. "You shouldn't have brought the watch back, Sarah," the man said as she approached. His voice was like the architect's, but with a sharper, more aggressive edge. "The balance is tipped. Oakhaven wasn't meant to hold that much weight." "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her hand moving to the brass key in her pocket. "Another architect. I am the junior partner," he said with a cold, thin smile. "And you are a breach of contract that needs to be settled. The loop is leaking. Look around you." Sarah looked. The shadows of the people walking by were no longer following their movements. The shadows were lagging behind, moving in slow motion, like they were still trapped in the 11:15 loop. The sky above the square began to tint toward a strange, deep purple. The train is the only thing keeping the waterfall from drowning this town. The junior partner continued. "By stopping the heart, you didn't free yourself. You just brought the end of the line to Oakhaven." "I have my grandfather's notes," Sarah countered, pulling out the blue ticket. "He said the architect built the dam. He didn't save us. He stalled us so he could collect us." The man's eyes locked onto the blue ticket. For the first time, his calm cracked. "Where did you get that?" "That ticket was revoked before the first cycle." "It was a gift," Sarah said, stepping closer. "And if the loop is leaking, I'm going to use that leak to find a way to stop you for good." The junior partner hissed. Before Sarah could react, he dissolved into a cloud of grey mist, which was instantly sucked into the saw grates of the street. Sarah stood alone in the square. The sky returned to blue, and the shadows snapped back to their owners. But she knew the warning was real. The train was no longer a separate place. Oakhaven was becoming the next carriage. Sarah knew she couldn't fight the architect's legacy alone. If the infinite line was leaking into Oakhaven, there had to be others who had felt the tremors of the tracks. The police had mentioned 3 other disappearances linked to the 11:15 line before it was decommissioned. If any of them had returned, they would be the only ones who could help her understand the blue ticket and the junior partner's threat. The Oakhaven Public Library had been transformed into a smart archive. The rows of dusty shelves Sarah remembered were replaced by glowing glass pillars filled with fiber optic pulses. Instead of card catalogs, there were hovering holographic interfaces that responded to eye movements. Sarah walked to the center of the room. Search. 11:15 disappearances. 2026 to 2036. The archive hummed. A cascade of digital files appeared in the air before her. Most were police reports she had already seen, but she filtered for recovered or found. The results were chilling. Out of the 4 people who had vanished from the line, only one other person had ever been found. His name was Elias Thorne. He had disappeared in 2028 and had been discovered wandering the old tracks 3 years later. Where is Elias Thorne now? Sarah asked the interface. Elias Thorne. Current status. Resident at the Grey Gables Sanitarium. Note: patient refuses all digital interfaces. Analog environment required. Sarah felt a jolt of recognition. The Grey Gables. It was an old Victorian mansion on the edge of town that had survived the tech boom. It was exactly the kind of place the train's influence would linger. As she moved to leave, the glass pillars around her began to flicker. The fiber-optic pulses changed from blue to a deep, bruised purple. The holographic files of the missing passengers began to distort, their faces stretching into the long, gaunt shapes of the forest people Sarah had seen from the train windows. Warning. System corruption. A calm, synthetic voice announced. On the screen in front of her, a new file opened by itself. It wasn't a police report. It was a blueprint. It showed the town of Oakhaven, but a set of spectral tracks was superimposed over the streets. The tracks formed a giant circle, exactly like the map in the conductor's office. At the center of the circle, where the heart should be, was her own house. It's not just a leak, Sarah whispered, her heart cold. It's an anchor. I'm the anchor. She grabbed her bag and ran for the exit. As she passed through the sliding glass doors, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold, a faint, rhythmic clack-clack, clack-clack of wheels on a track, coming from somewhere deep beneath the library floor. The Grey Gables felt like a fortress against the future. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of beeswax and stale tea. There were no holograms here, only old-fashioned incandescent bulbs that cast long, amber shadows. He doesn't like visitors, the nurse told Sarah as they walked down a hallway. And he doesn't like time. We had to remove all the clocks from his room. He says the ticking sounds like, well, he says it sounds like a hammer. They reached room 12B. Sarah felt a shiver. It was the same number as the seat in the train carriage. Inside, the room was dimly lit. An old man sat in a rocking chair, his back to the door. He was surrounded by piles of hand-drawn maps. Every piece of paper was covered in the same image. A train engine with a face that looked like a screaming human. Elias. Sarah said softly. The man didn't turn. You're late, he rasped. The 11:15 arrived 10 years ago. You're just the echo. Sarah walked around to face him. Elias Thorne was only in his 50s, but he looked 80. His eyes were milky with cataracts, yet they seemed to see right through her. He stopped rocking when he saw the blue scarf around her neck. Clara's scarf, he breathed, his voice trembling. She gave it to the girl who promised to find the driver. Did you find him, Sarah? Did you see the architect? I saw him, Sarah said, sitting on a low stool beside him. I broke the heart. I thought I stopped the train, Elias. But it followed me home. It's here, in Oakhaven. Elias grabbed her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong, his skin feeling like dry parchment. You didn't break the train, child. You just broke the glass. The infinite line isn't a machine. It's a hunger. It doesn't want passengers anymore. It wants a station. It wants a world to settle in. He pointed to a map on his lap. It was Oakhaven, but he had shaded certain areas in heavy charcoal. The glitch zones. That's where the walls are thin. If the train finds enough anchors, it will pull Oakhaven out of time entirely. We'll be just another carriage in the loop. How do we stop it? Sarah asked. The blue ticket, Elias whispered, looking at her pocket. It's not just for a private box. It's an override. But you have to go to the place where the tracks first touched this earth. You have to go to the old quarry. Sarah left the sanitarium and headed straight for the old quarry. It was a desolate place on the northern edge of town, abandoned decades ago. As she climbed the perimeter fence, the air began to vibrate. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling in her teeth, a high-frequency hum that made her dizzy. The deeper she went into the woods surrounding the quarry, the more the world began to glitch. A tree to her left suddenly shifted, its leaves turning into shards of grey glass before snapping back to oak. A patch of grass flickered, revealing the red carpet of the dining carriage beneath the soil. The lavender scent of her scarf became so strong it made her eyes water. "It's happening," she whispered. She reached the edge of the quarry pit. Down below, in the crater of the earth, the mist was thick and purple. And there, standing in the center of the mist, were the tracks. They weren't rusted or overgrown. They were shining, silver, and new. They pulsed with a rhythmic light that matched the ticking of the watch in her pocket. Standing on the tracks was the junior partner. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood the ticket collector, his heavy metal puncher glinting in the twilight. "The anchor has arrived," the junior partner called out, his voice echoing off the quarry walls. "Welcome to the new station, Sarah. We've been preparing the platform for you." The ticket collector stepped forward, his heavy boots making no sound on the spectral tracks. "Ticket, please," he growled. Sarah reached into her pocket. She didn't pull out the gold ticket. She pulled out the blue ticket, the one her grandfather had hidden. The silver ink on the card began to glow with a fierce, blinding intensity. "I'm not here to board," Sarah shouted, the wind whipping her hair around her face. "I'm here to revoke the contract." The junior partner's face contorted with rage. "You don't have the authority. You're just a passenger." "I'm the conductor's granddaughter," Sarah countered, holding the blue ticket high. "And this is a private box. You're evicted." She slammed the blue ticket against the brass key in her other hand. A shockwave of silver light erupted from the contact, tearing through the purple mist. The spectral tracks let out a sound like a dying animal, a long, screeching wail of metal on metal that shook the very foundation of the quarry. The silver shockwave from the blue ticket didn't just clear the mist. It peeled back the skin of reality. The old quarry was gone, replaced by a monumental structure that shouldn't have existed. It was a station made of rib-like iron beams and glass that pulsed with the heartbeat of a dying star. This was the origin point, the zero station. Sarah stood on a platform that felt like it was vibrating at the frequency of a scream. The ticket collector, Mr. Henderson, didn't move like a human anymore. His body flickered, his dark coat stretching into a cloud of iron filings. Every time he stepped forward, the sound of a heavy metal puncher echoed like a gunshot. "The contract is iron," Henderson growled, his voice a distorted roar. "You cannot revoke what has already been consumed. 10 years of your life are the fuel for this station. You are not a passenger. You are the coal." He lunged. Sarah dodged behind a spectral pillar, the air where she had been standing turning into a jagged hole of static. She looked at the blue ticket. It was vibrating so hard it was cutting her palm. The silver ink was bleeding into her skin, glowing through her veins like liquid moonlight. Elias said this was an override, she hissed to herself. "Think, Sarah. It's a legal document. Every override has a condition." She flipped the ticket over. In the blinding light, she saw new text appearing beneath her grandfather's note. It wasn't in ink. It was etched into the fibers of the card. "The conductor may cease the line only if the passengers are accounted for." Sarah looked around the ghost station. In the shadows of the iron ribs, she saw them. Hundreds of people, pale and flickering, were standing in line. They were the people from the box of photos, the ones the train had collected over the decades. They were the anchors. Their memories were being used to bridge the gap between the infinite line and Oakhaven. Henderson isn't the one in charge, Sarah realized. He's just the bailiff. The ticket collector swung his massive arm, shattering the pillar Sarah was hiding behind. She fell to the ground, the golden watch sliding out of her pocket. It hit the spectral tracks and began to glow with a fierce, amber light. Suddenly, the ticking changed. It wasn't 11:15 anymore. The hands were spinning wildly, creating a localized vortex of time. Henderson stopped, his iron-filing body beginning to unravel in the temporal wind. "The passengers!" Sarah shouted, standing up and holding the blue ticket toward the shadows. "I account for them all. By the authority of Henry Miller, the line is closed." The ticket collector let out a final, metallic shriek and dissolved into a pile of rusted washers and broken springs. But the station didn't vanish. The purple light intensified, and from the center of the tracks, a figure began to emerge, a figure Sarah had hoped she would never see again. The architect stepped out of the light. He looked different than he had on the train. He wasn't a fading shadow. He was solid, radiant, and terrifyingly calm. He wore a suit of the same midnight blue as Sarah's ticket, and his tea-colored eyes were full of a strange, paternal sadness. "You have become quite the litigator, Sarah," the architect said, his voice cutting through the roar of the temporal vortex. "You've defeated my bailiff. You've found the override. But tell me, do you truly want to win?" He waved his hand, and the ghost station changed. The iron beams turned into the warm, wooden walls of her grandfather's old bakery. The smell of fresh bread and cinnamon filled the air. Sarah saw her younger self, 10 years ago, sitting at the counter, laughing with her grandfather. "I can give this back to you," the architect whispered, stepping closer. "Not as a memory, as reality. I can rewrite the tracks so that the 11:15 never arrived. You can have your 10 years back. You can have your grandfather back. All you have to do is hand me the watch." Sarah's heart ached. The image was so perfect. She could almost taste the sugar on the bread. She could see her grandfather's scar on his chin, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. It was the life she had been robbed of. "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Why do you care if I stay or go?" "Because the train needs a conductor who understands the stakes," the architect said. "Henry is tired. He wants to rest. If you take his place, you can curate the lives of everyone you love. You can keep Oakhaven safe in a perfect, golden loop where no one ever dies, no one grows old, and no one ever suffers." Sarah looked at the golden watch on the tracks. It was still spinning. Then she looked at the blue scarf around her neck. She thought of Clara, who had been lost in the tunnel. She thought of Elias Thorne, rotting in a sanitarium because he couldn't live in a world that wasn't timed right. "A perfect loop is a stagnant pond," Sarah said, her voice growing cold. "You talked about the waterfall, but you forgot that a waterfall is what keeps the river alive. My grandfather didn't want to keep me safe. He wanted me to be free." She looked the architect in the eye. "The past is a debt that's already been paid. I'm not signing your new contract." The architect's face darkened. The bakery began to rot, the walls peeling away to reveal the cold iron of the ghost station once more. "Then you choose the waterfall," he hissed, "and you will drown in the now." The architect raised his hands, and the spectral tracks began to glow with a violent, pulsating energy. The leak was no longer a trickle. It was a flood. Back in the real Oakhaven. Sarah could hear the sirens wailing as the town began to glitch into the ghost station. "The anchor is your heart, Sarah," the architect shouted. "As long as you hold onto your grief for the years you lost, the train has a hook in this world." Sarah realized he was right. Her desire to go back, her anger at the lost decade, that was the bridge. She looked at the brass key in her hand. It wasn't just a key to an office. It was the key to her grandfather's legacy. "I let it go," Sarah whispered. She took the blue ticket, the brass key, and the golden watch. She knelt on the tracks and placed them all together in a small pile. I release the time, she said, her voice echoing through the station. I release the memories. I release the debt. She took the heavy iron puncher that Henderson had dropped, the bailiff's tool. With a cry of defiance, she slammed the puncher down onto the golden watch. The glass didn't just break, it shattered into 1,000 points of light. The temporal vortex collapsed inward. The blue ticket and the brass key were consumed in a flash of white-hot fire. A massive shockwave erupted from the point of impact, tearing the spectral tracks from the earth. The architect let out a scream of pure, hollow frustration as he was pulled back into the void. "You've killed the dream," he cried, his form dissolving into grey mist. "I've started the clock," Sarah replied. The ghost station began to crumble. The iron beams turned to dust, and the glass ribs shattered into harmless rain. Sarah felt the ground fall away. She was plummeting through the purple mist, the sound of the train fading into the distance one last time. She felt a hand catch hers. For a split second, she saw her grandfather, Henry. He wasn't wearing the conductor's uniform. He was in his baker's apron, and he was smiling. "Well done, Sarah," he whispered. "Now, go home." Sarah hit the dirt of the old quarry. The purple light was gone. The mist had cleared. The sun was setting over Oakhaven, casting a long, natural orange glow over the trees. The tracks were gone. The hum was silent. She reached up to her neck. The blue scarf was still there, but it was just a piece of fabric now. No magic, no lavender scent, just a memory. Sarah stood up, her body aching, and looked toward the town. The lights were coming on in the houses. People were finishing their dinners, unaware that their reality had almost been consumed. She began the walk back to her mother's house, her steps heavy but certain. The quiet of Oakhaven was no longer a threat. It was a gift. Sarah walked through the front door of her mother's house, not as a fugitive from a ghost train, but as a woman finally standing on the right side of history. The battle at the quarry had left her exhausted, her muscles aching from the strain of resisting a reality that wasn't hers. The morning after the quarry was different. Sarah woke up to the sound of a normal robin chirping outside her window, a messy, organic sound that didn't follow a rhythmic loop. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the floor to tilt or the smell of ozone to fill the room. It didn't happen. She looked at her nightstand. The golden watch was gone, destroyed in the blast. In its place was a small pile of fine, white sand, the only physical remains of the temporal anchor. She ran her fingers through it, feeling the grit. It was just glass and metal now, returned to the base elements of the earth. Martha came in with a tray of breakfast. She looked 10 years younger, the heavy cloud of worry that had defined her face since 2026 finally beginning to lift. "You slept for 14 hours, she said, setting the tray down. "Dr. Aries called. He wants to run more tests, but I told him you needed to be a daughter today, not a patient." Sarah sat up, the joints in her 30-year-old body protesting. "The town," she asked. "Is it stable?" "The glitches stopped last night," Martha replied, sitting on the edge of the bed. "The news is calling it a localized electromagnetic surge. They don't know what really happened at the quarry, and I don't think they ever will. People are just happy their holograms stopped flickering." Sarah took a bite of toast. It tasted like bread. It didn't offer a memory or a trap. It just offered sustenance. "I need to go back to the city, Mom. Not to stay. But I need to settle my life. I'm still a missing person in the eyes of the law." The legal battle ahead was daunting. She had to prove she was Sarah Miller, explain a 10-year gap without sounding insane, and somehow reclaim her identity in a world that had moved into a digital era she barely understood. She was a lawyer specialized in 2020 statutes in a 2030s world. She realized she was a living anomaly. She was a bridge between the analog past and the high-tech future. But as she looked at her mother, she knew she wasn't alone. She had the one thing the architect could never truly replicate: a future that wasn't written in advance. 3 days later, Sarah was sitting on the porch, reading a digital tablet her mother had bought her. She was trying to catch up on 10 years of legal precedents, but the tech was frustrating. Every time she tried to turn a page, her fingers, still accustomed to the friction of paper, triggered the wrong sensor. A car pulled up to the curb. It wasn't a modern, silent electric pod. It was an older model, a hybrid from the early 2030s that made a distinct, low hum. A young woman stepped out. She looked to be about 24, with dark, curly hair and a camera bag slung over her shoulder. She walked up the path, stopping at the gate. She looked at Sarah with an intensity that made Sarah's skin crawl. It wasn't the look of a curious neighbor. It was the look of someone who had seen a ghost. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked, standing up. The woman didn't answer immediately. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, black notebook. It was identical to the one Clara had carried on the train. "My name is Maya," the woman said, her voice trembling. "I'm a journalist. I'm looking for the woman who wore the blue scarf." Sarah felt a bolt of electricity go through her. She touched the scarf, which was currently draped over the back of her chair. "Clara," she whispered. Maya nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Clara was my grandmother. She disappeared when I was 14. She used to tell me stories about a great circle and a man in a grey suit. Everyone thought she was losing her mind, but she kept a diary. The last entry was about a woman named Sarah who would find the heart." Sarah opened the gate. "Come inside, Maya. We have a lot to talk about." As they sat in the living room, Maya explained that she wasn't the only one. Since the surge at the quarry, dozens of people across the country had started remembering things. Small things, a rhythmic ticking in their ears, the smell of a dining carriage, the feeling of being watched by someone in a grey suit. The loop didn't just hold people, Maya said, opening her grandmother's notebook. It held their stories. When you broke the heart, you released them. I'm here because I want to help you tell the truth. Not the police version. The real version. Sarah looked at the notebook. It was filled with Clara's sharp, frantic handwriting. It was a map of a different kind. A map of the people the train had stolen. "The architect isn't a ghost, Sarah," Maya said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He's a legacy." The Infinite Line was a project funded by a corporation called Temporal Dynamics. They wanted to study stagnant time for long-term space travel or medical stasis. But the project went wrong, and they just let the train keep running to hide the evidence. Sarah leaned back, her lawyer's brain finally clicking into gear. For the first time since she returned, she felt like she had a weapon. If this was a corporate project, then there's a paper trail. There are contracts. There are victims. And there are survivors, Maya added. I found 5 others. People who returned years ago but were silenced or put away like Elias Thorne. They're afraid, Sarah. They think the train is still coming for them. Sarah stood up and walked to the window. She looked out at the peaceful street of Oakhaven. The architect had tried to make her a prisoner of her own grief, but he had given her something else instead. He had given her a unique perspective on the most valuable commodity in the world, time. They don't have to be afraid, Sarah said, her voice firm. We aren't just going to tell a story, Maya. We're going to file a suit. We're going to hold Temporal Dynamics accountable for every second they stole from us. But you're a missing person, Maya pointed out. You don't even have a valid ID in the 2036 system. Sarah smiled, a sharp, confident smile that she hadn't worn in a decade. Then that's where we start. I'm going to use their own system to prove I exist. And once I'm officially Sarah Miller again, I'm going to make sure the Infinite Line is never rebuilt. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room, despite the windows being closed. On the coffee table, a small silver tool, the one Sarah had found outside her door days ago, began to vibrate. It spun slowly, eventually pointing toward the city. "They know we're talking," Sarah said, looking at the tool. The junior partner wasn't just a shadow. He's the CEO of Temporal Dynamics now. He's the one who was supposed to inherit the loop. Maya gripped her notebook. "What do we do?" "We go to the city," Sarah said. "We find the others. And we show the architect's heirs that some things can't be kept in a circle." The journey back to the city was not by train. Sarah couldn't bring herself to step onto a platform just yet. Instead, Maya drove her in the hybrid car, moving along highways that were now lined with glowing solar panels and automated freight convoys. The skyline of the city appeared on the horizon, a forest of shimmering needles that seemed to pierce the very clouds. The city Sarah remembered was a place of brick, concrete, and the constant, comforting roar of combustion engines. The city of 2036 was silent and sterile. Skybridges connected the skyscrapers, and the air was filled with the soft action of delivery drones. As they crossed the bridge into the downtown district, Sarah felt the weight of the decade more than ever. "Everything is so clean," Sarah remarked, looking out at a park that was now entirely vertical, climbing the side of a massive residential tower. "It's a facade," Maya said, navigating through the automated traffic. "Underneath all this smart infrastructure is the same old greed. Temporal Dynamics owns almost 30% of this district. They didn't just build offices, they built the backbone of the city's data network." They headed to a small, unassuming apartment in the older part of the city, one of the few blocks that hadn't been demolished. This was where Julian Vane's predecessor had lived. Marcus Thorne, the man who had designed the original 1115 engine. Marcus was a broken man. He sat in a room filled with analog blueprints, refusing to use a single light that wasn't battery-powered. When Sarah and Maya entered, he didn't look up from his desk. He was busy drawing the same circular track Elias had drawn in the sanitarium. "You're the one from the quarry," Marcus said, his voice a dry rasp. "I felt the surge. You snapped the mainspring." "I'm Sarah Miller," Sarah said, sitting across from him. "I was a passenger. Now, I'm the lawyer who's going to dismantle the company that stole your designs." Marcus finally looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. "You can't dismantle a ghost, Sarah. Temporal Dynamics isn't a company anymore. It's an algorithm. Julian Vane, the junior partner you met, he isn't just the CEO. He's the first successful integrated passenger. He exists half in the loop and half in the world." Sarah leaned in, her lawyer's instincts sharpening. "Then he's a liability. If he's part of the loop, then he's subject to the same laws of physics, and the same contract, as the train. I have the blue ticket, Marcus. I have the override. I need to know how to apply it to a person, not a machine." Marcus reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, glass vial filled with a silver liquid. "This is the fuel. It's condensed time. If you can get close enough to Vane to expose him to it while holding the ticket, his physical body will be forced to choose a single point in time. He will age 10 years in 10 seconds. He will become mortal again." Sarah didn't go to the Temporal Dynamics Tower immediately. She spent the next 2 days with Maya, tracking down the other 4 survivors. They met in the back room of an old library, a place where the digital reach of the corporation was weak. There was Arthur, a former conductor who had been retired early. There was Elena, a woman who had spent 5 years in the dining carriage before escaping at a station made of salt. Each of them bore the same marks, a sensitivity to ticking clocks and a deep, localized coldness in their bones. "They think we are ghosts," Sarah told them, her voice echoing in the small room. "They think we are just data points they can erase. But we are the living evidence of a decade of human rights violations. We are the class." They have the best lawyers in the world, Sarah. Arthur said, his voice shaking. And they have the technology to make us disappear before we even reach the courthouse. They have the technology. Sarah agreed, holding up the glass vial Marcus had given her. But they don't have the truth. In a court of law, even in 2036, a contract cannot stand if it was built on a lie. We aren't going to sue them for money. We are going to sue them for our time. She began to organize their testimonies, treating the stories of ghost trains and purple forests as if they were corporate fraud cases. She found the leak in the Temporal Dynamics Charter, a clause about experimental transit that had never been authorized by the Federal Rail Commission. As they worked, the lights in the library began to flicker. The deep purple tint returned to the shadows. Sarah felt the silver tool in her pocket heat up. "They are here," Elena whispered, pointing to the window. Outside, the street was empty of people, but the sky bridges were glowing with an unnatural intensity. A fleet of sleek, black drones was hovering outside the library, their red sensors focused on the building. A voice boomed from the street, amplified by 1,000 speakers. It was Julian Vane. "Sarah Miller, you are in possession of proprietary corporate property. Return the blue ticket and the fuel, and we can discuss a settlement. Refuse, and we will simply accelerate the waterfall for everyone in this room." Sarah looked at her team of ghosts. For the first time, they didn't look afraid. They looked angry. The Temporal Dynamics headquarters was a pillar of black glass that stood in the center of the city like an obsidian needle. Sarah walked through the front doors alone, her hand clutching the blue ticket and the silver vial. Maya and the others were positioned at various digital nodes across the city, ready to upload Marcus's blueprints to the public net the moment Sarah gave the signal. The lobby was a cathedral of light and silence. There were no security guards, only sleek, white robots that moved with unsettling grace. "Floor 100. Sarah told the elevator. The lift didn't move. The world around it did. Within seconds, the doors opened into a vast office that overlooked the entire city. Julian Vane sat behind a desk made of solid light. He looked exactly as he had in Oakhaven, young, sharp, and entirely too still. "You've caused quite a disruption in the stock price, Sarah," Julian said, not looking up from a holographic ledger. "The board is not pleased. We spent billions stabilizing the Oakhaven anchor." "I'm not here for your stock price, Julian," Sarah said, walking toward him. The air in the room felt thin, vibrating with the power of a hidden engine. "I'm here to serve you. You're being sued for 10,000 years of aggregate stolen time." Julian laughed, a dry, mechanical sound. "In what court?" "The 2036 judiciary is funded by our data. No judge will hear your fairy tales about a ghost train." "They won't have to," Sarah said, reaching the edge of his desk. She pulled out the blue ticket. The silver ink began to pulse, reacting to Julian's presence. "This ticket is a contract override. It recognizes the integrated passenger as a breach of the Infinite Lines Charter. You aren't the CEO, Julian. You're a stowaway." Julian stood up, his face contorting. For a moment, his image flickered, revealing a man who looked decades older, his skin gray and translucent. "The loop is what keeps me alive. Without it, I am nothing." "Then be nothing," Sarah said. She smashed the glass vial of silver fuel onto the blue ticket. A blinding flash of chronological energy erupted. The light didn't fill the room. It focused entirely on Julian. The silver liquid turned into a swirling vortex of years, months, and days, all pouring into his body at once. Julian screamed. His youthful face began to sag, his hair turning white and falling away in clumps. The integrated parts of him, the digital echoes of the train, were being burned away by the raw power of the condensed time. In seconds, The junior partner was gone. In his place was a frail, elderly man who collapsed into his chair, gasping for air. "The loop is closed," Sarah said, her voice cold. "And the world is finally watching." Behind her, the holographic screens in the office began to broadcast the blueprints and the testimonies of the survivors to every screen in the city. The secret of the 1115 was finally out. The fall of Julian Vane was only the beginning. As the silver mist of the fuel settled in the penthouse of the glass tower, the high-tech heart of the city began to beat to a different rhythm. The news of temporal dynamics illegal experiments flickered on every holographic billboard. But Sarah knew that in the year 2036, a scandal was just data until it was forged into a verdict. The courtroom of the 2030s was a far cry from the wood-paneled halls Sarah had frequented in her youth. It was a sterile, circular chamber where the judge sat behind a curtain of light, and the jury consisted of a hybrid panel of 3 human experts and an advanced ethical algorithm. Sarah stood at the petitioner's podium, her shoulders back, wearing a suit that was 10 years out of date but sharp enough to cut glass. Across the aisle, a phalanx of corporate defense lawyers, men and women who looked like they were carved from the same grey marble as the architect, sat with their hands folded. "Your Honor, the defense claims that Sarah Miller is a chronological anomaly with no standing." Sarah began, her voice echoing with a resonance she hadn't felt in a decade. "They claim the 1115 line was a mere simulation. But I do not bring you a simulation. I bring you 10 years of stolen life." She activated her tablet, and a hologram of the blue ticket appeared in the center of the room. "This ticket is more than a pass. It is a contract of adhesion, forced upon passengers without their consent. Under the Fair Transit Act of 2028, a law passed while I was trapped in the loop, any corporate-owned infrastructure that alters a passenger's biological timeline without a signed waiver is liable for total asset forfeiture." The corporate lawyers laughed. "Ms. Miller is a ghost," the lead counsel sneered. "She has no birth certificate in the 2036 registry. She technically doesn't exist. How can a non-entity sue a corporation?" Sarah didn't flinch. She reached into her bag and pulled out the shattered pieces of the golden watch. She placed them on the evidence plate. "I may not have a digital ID, but I have the physical evidence of your crime. This watch didn't just tell time. It regulated a captive reality. If I don't exist, then why does your company have a line-item budget for passenger maintenance for seat 12B?" The ethical algorithm flickered from amber to green. For the first time, the corporate defense looked nervous. The air in the room grew cold, and the smell of lavender and old smoke began to drift from the ventilation shafts. Sarah knew the architect was watching. He wasn't in the courtroom, but the loop was trying to reclaim the room. As the trial entered its 3rd day, the boundaries between the courtroom and the ghost station began to dissolve. It started with a low hum in the floorboards. Then, the holographic displays of the court records began to glitch, the text turning into the jagged, silver script of the infinite line. "The architect is desperate," Maya whispered to Sarah during a recess. "The more you win in the real world, the faster the loop collapses. He's trying to drag the entire city into the 1115. Sarah walked to the window of the courthouse. Outside, the sky was a bruised purple. The sleek drones of the city were hovering in midair, frozen in time. People on the sidewalks were standing perfectly still, their expressions caught in mid-sentence. The waterfall was being held back by a single, flickering thread. "He wants the ticket back." Sarah realized. The blue ticket is the only thing that can finalize the closure. As long as it's in the physical world, he can't restart the circle. Suddenly, the doors of the courtroom burst open. It wasn't the police or the corporate lawyers. It was the ticket collector, Henderson. His form was jagged and pixelated, a nightmare of rusted iron and static. He held his metal puncher high, and every step he took left a trail of frost on the high-tech floor. "Court is adjourned," Henderson roared, his voice a distorted chorus of 1,000 train whistles. The human judges fled. The ethical algorithm sparked and died. Sarah stood her ground as the ticket collector moved toward her. The master demands the override. Henderson growled. You have played the lawyer. Sarah. Now play the victim. Sarah didn't run. She grabbed the blue ticket and held it against the evidence plate, which was still holding the shards of the golden watch. I'm not a victim, Henderson. I'm the prosecutor, and the evidence is about to be entered into the record. She activated the plate's high-energy scan. The machine, designed to analyze physical matter, hit the temporal fragments with a burst of light. The reaction was violent. A rift opened in the center of the courtroom, a swirling vortex of white light that began to pull Henderson in. You can't close the line. Henderson screamed as his iron body began to flake away. The architect is the heart. Without the heart, there is no pulse. The world has its own pulse. Sarah shouted over the roar of the wind. And it doesn't need yours. Henderson was gone, but the rift remained open. From the white void, they began to emerge. Not monsters, and not shadows, but people. One by one, the passengers of the 1115 stepped into the courtroom of 2036. There was the man from the White Sand Station. There was the woman who had lived in the dining carriage. Hundreds of them filled the room, their faces pale but their eyes clear for the first time in decades. They weren't just data points. They were a jury of shadows. The architect finally appeared, manifesting at the judge's bench. He didn't look like a god anymore. He looked like an old, tired man in a dusty grey suit. You've brought them all here, the architect said, his voice a soft, dry rasp. You've emptied the train. Do you know what happens to a train with no passengers? Sarah. It has no reason to exist. The energy that holds this town together will dissipate. You will save their souls, but you will destroy their city. The city will survive the truth. Sarah countered. She turned to the crowd of ghosts. Do you want to stay in the loop? Do you want to go back to 1115? A collective no rippled through the room, a sound like the rustling of a forest. Sarah looked at the architect. The jury has reached a verdict. We reject the safety of the circle. We choose the danger of the now. She took the blue ticket and placed it on the judge's gavel block. She picked up the heavy wooden mallet and brought it down with everything she had. The sound wasn't a bang. It was a crack that split the sky. The purple light shattered like glass. The ghost station, the dining carriage, and the architect himself dissolved into a flurry of white flower petals. The waterfall didn't drown the city. It washed it clean. Sarah stood in the silent, empty courtroom. The ghosts were gone, finally allowed to move into the stream of time. The corporate lawyers were gone. Their contracts turned to ash. Maya walked up to her, her eyes wide with wonder. It's over. Sarah. The loop is gone. Look. Sarah looked out the window. The drones were moving again. The people on the sidewalk were walking, talking, and living. The sun was setting, but for the first time in 10 years. Sarah knew that it would actually rise on a new day. The dust of the collapsed loop didn't just vanish. It settled into the history books. In the weeks that followed the courtroom confrontation, the city, and the world, had to grapple with a truth that was stranger than any fiction. The infinite line was gone, and with it, the shadow of temporal dynamics. The liquidation of temporal dynamics was the largest corporate dissolution in the history of the 21st century. Sarah Miller, once a missing person, was now the most famous lawyer in the world. She didn't work from a glass tower. She worked from a small analog office in Oakhaven, where the smell of old paper and fresh coffee provided a grounded reality that no hologram could mimic. The Miller settlement wasn't just about money. Sarah had negotiated something far more radical. The Chronological Rights Act. Restitution of identity. Every passenger recovered from the loop was granted immediate legal status, with their ages adjusted for biological reality rather than calendar years. The Memorial Fund. The assets of the corporation were seized to build reintegration centers for those who, like Elias Thorne, had spent too long in the purple mist. Archival justice. All data related to the 1115 line was made public, ensuring that no one could ever again treat human time as a corporate resource. Sarah sat at her desk, looking over a list of the passengers she had helped. Elena was opening an art gallery. Arthur was teaching history at a local college. They were no longer ghosts. They were people with futures. Maya walked into the office, carrying a finalized copy of the settlement. The junior partner, Julian Vane, died yesterday, she said softly. His body just couldn't handle the now. He aged 90 years in a week. Sarah looked out the window. He was a victim of his own loop. Maya. He thought he could own time, but time is a creditor that always collects. What about you, Sarah? Maya asked. The settlement includes a massive personal payout. You could go anywhere. You could live the 10 years you missed in luxury. Sarah touched the blue scarf around her neck. I don't want to live the years I missed. I want to live the years I have. I've spent enough time looking at maps of circles. I'd like to see where a straight line goes for a change. She stood up and grabbed her coat. There was one final stop she needed to make. The legal battle was won, and the corporation was gone. But there was a personal debt she still needed to settle at the very edge of town. The old Oakhaven station was no longer a place of ghosts. Under the new settlement, it had been turned into a public park. The rusted tracks had been removed, replaced by a walking path lined with wildflowers that bloomed in every color of the rainbow. Real, vibrant colors, not the muted grays of the train. Sarah walked to the spot where she had first reappeared. A simple wooden bench stood there now, dedicated to the memory of Henry Miller, the last conductor. She sat down and felt the sun on her face. For the first time in what felt like a century, her ears didn't ring with the sound of ticking. The silence was natural, filled with the distant laughter of children playing and the rustle of leaves in the wind. She reached into her pocket and found a small, smooth stone she had picked up from the quarry. She placed it on the bench. I did it, Grandpa. She whispered. The line is closed. Everyone is home. As she spoke, a faint, familiar warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't the searing heat of the golden watch or the cold bite of the silver fuel. It was a gentle, fading glow. For a fleeting second, she saw a figure standing at the far end of the path. He wasn't a shadow or a glitch. He was an old man in a baker's apron, waving a flour-dusted hand before walking into the light of the setting sun. Sarah smiled. She took the blue scarf from her neck, the scarf that had been her shield, her memory, and her anchor. She didn't need it anymore. She draped it over the back of the bench, leaving it there for the wind to eventually take. She looked at her hand. She wore a simple, modern smartwatch now. It didn't tell her the true time or the loop time. It just told her it was 5:30 p.m. Friday, May 22nd, 2036. It was a beautiful evening, and she had dinner plans with her mother. As she walked away from the station, Sarah didn't look back. She didn't check for shadows or listen for the movement of wheels. She walked with the steady, rhythmic gait of a woman who knew exactly where she was going. The 11:15 had been a journey into the dark, but it had taught her one thing: every second is a gift, and every now is a chance to start over. The infinite line had ended, but Sarah Miller's story was only just beginning. She stepped off the park path and onto the sidewalk of the main street, disappearing into the crowd of people living their lives, one precious, unscripted moment at a time.